Hey guys, tonight we drift back through the dusty corridors of time, not to kings or conquests, but to the quiet, oddly specific rules that governed everyday life in ancient Babylon. You slip into a woolen robe that scratches just a little at the neckline, the scent of baked mud and sweet fig paste wafting through the alleys. Torches flicker from crooked windows, casting long shadows over stone walkways polished by centuries of sandals. You hear it, the soft hum of voices bartering, a donkey snorting in protest, and somewhere close, definitely closer than you'd like, a cat coughing up something regrettable behind a clay wall. And yet for all the serenity of the scene, you probably wouldn't survive this. Babylon's laws, they don't play, miss curfew? There's a rule. Let your goat eat someone's cucumbers? Rule. Sleep through your grain contract renewal? Oh, there's a rule, and it's weirdly specific. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, what's your location and what time are you listening? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander into the market square just as the last shaft of moonlight splits over the temple dome. Babylon's night market was less like a 24-hour convenience store and more like a sleep-deprived ant colony. Traders hawk salted fish, wool scraps, and papyrus charms. But oddly, many are hurriedly closing shop because Babylon, for all its grandeur, had a bedtime. Well, for markets anyway. There's a law for that. Stall vendors were expected to shut down by a certain hour. Sunset in the summer, torch hour in the cooler months. No moonlight lemonade stands, no midnight fish auctions. If you were caught selling after hours, you could be fined, shamed publicly, or worse, accused of trying to bypass the temple tax, which was a solid way to get your sandals confiscated and your reputation salted like last week's carp. You eye a bearded melon seller rolling up his tarp with surprising precision. He's muttering under his breath about a customer who tried to haggle after torch hour. That's when you notice the market inspector, a man with a clipboard-shaped tablet, stylus dangling from a cord, like an overworked librarian. He's not yelling, just watching. That's worse, somehow. One of the quieter laws, and one historians often forget to highlight, is that Babylon had noise regulations. Seriously, temple districts and residential alleys had written rules about shouting, clanging pots, or, brace yourself, excessively loud goats. If your livestock made a ruckus during designated silence hours, you might get a warning. A second offense, a fine in barley. A third, you might be assigned to sewer maintenance, which, considering the plumbing of the era, was less career pivot and more existential punishment. The reason for these curfews and sound ordinances was surprisingly progressive. The priests claimed that loud noise after sundown disrupted the gods, but more likely, the real gods were cranky old men trying to sleep off too much fermented fig juice. Still, that didn't stop rebels. You turn down a quieter alley and catch the subtle hiss of a black market dice game. Technically, gambling wasn't banned, but unlicensed games after market close were. Babylonian dice weren't just for fun. They could settle disputes, make offerings, or in the wrong hands determine land boundaries, which, don't laugh, actually sparked lawsuits that lasted years. A young man sees you lingering and tugs his hood. "You're not a scribe, are you?" he mutters, side-eyeing your sandals. You shake your head. He relaxes, tosses a knuckle-bone die, and groans. "Should have stayed home. That melon seller cursed me." Which brings you to one more odd detail. Curses had legal consequences. Not magical ones, actual ones. If you accused someone of cursing your business and couldn't prove it, you'd owe them silver. But if you could prove it, say they carved a hex into a public wall, then the priest scribes might issue a cleansing rite. And the offender? They'd spend 3 days sweeping temple floors while chanting apologies loudly in front of everyone. There's something comforting about this chaos. You get the sense that for every monumental ziggurat or world-changing empire, Babylon's daily life thrived in its tiny, tedious rules. The kind of rules that told a melon seller when to pack up, or find a shepherd whose goat was overly spirited. As the torches begin to dim and the crowd thins, you find yourself stepping into a courtyard where clay tablets are stacked like sleepy bricks. They're old laws, obsolete now, but once sacred. And somewhere on one of them is the rule that says market music can't have drums after dark. Imagine being the ancient Babylonian equivalent of a jazz flutist and getting fined because your cousin couldn't keep it mellow after sundown. Still, you like that. There's something deeply human about it. Even then, people wanted peace, quiet, and, most importantly, a solid night's sleep, just like you. You turn away from the quieting market, its torches flickering out one by one, like yawning stars, and head toward the residential lanes, where life was less about haggling and more about haircuts, sourdough, and suspiciously specific laws involving bread crusts. This is where things get domestically weird. You pause at the threshold of a modest mud brick courtyard, the smell of roasted onions clinging to the evening air. A man sits under a canopy of reeds, trimming another man's beard with a blade so dull it might qualify as a butter knife. But here's the catch. That man isn't just any beard snipper. He's a licensed beard trimmer, a legal profession with consequences if messed up, which, if you're wondering, involved monetary fines or public humiliation, depending on how lopsided the final result was. In Babylon, beards weren't just facial accessories. They were social currency, declarations of manhood, sometimes even political statements. You couldn't just let anyone go near your chin. Barbers, like bakers, had to follow laws that governed everything from hygiene to pricing. Overcharge for a haircut, and you might get your tools confiscated. Accidentally nick an earlobe? That's a formal complaint. And yes, there's a tablet for that. As you stroll farther into the residential quarter, the scent of yeast pulls you toward another legally controlled profession, the baker. And oh, the Babylonian obsession with bread. You think your neighborhood bakery's gluten-free labeling is intense? Babylon had rules about how round a loaf could be. Literally. There were weight standards, shape standards, and even crust expectations. If your loaf was too small or shaped like a duck when it should have resembled a disc, fined, or worse, blacklisted by the temple kitchens. You pass a woman inspecting round loaves with the precision of a jeweler, muttering, "Not enough sesame on this one. Do they think I was born yesterday?" It wasn't just about food. Bread was currency, offering, and oath keeper. If you made bad bread and gave it to a soldier, that could be viewed as sabotage. If you tried to pawn off sour bread to the temple priests, that bordered on sacrilege. Historians still argue whether these standards were strictly enforced or mostly ceremonial, but clay records suggest there were actual court cases about sourdough density. Just past the bakery district, you hear a low voice murmuring formulas behind a cloth curtain. A perfumer, or maybe a brewer, measuring ingredients in tiny scoops, another legally delicate job. You see, in Babylon, measurements were sacred. If your scales were off, trouble. If your beer was watery, bigger trouble. And if you tried to barter with fake goods, say watered-down date syrup, that was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Speaking of bartering, you wander into a dimly lit square where old men sit cross-legged, playing what looks like a game of counting stones. But it's not a game. It's a barter negotiation, a live tally of beard trims traded for bread, sheep milk swapped for sandals, even firewood exchanged for perfumed oil. And all of it backed by legal agreements, sometimes written, sometimes witnessed, sometimes whispered and remembered by the local elder who, let's be honest, enjoyed being the neighborhood's living receipt. You hear him pipe up from the sidelines. "That's not how many loaves you promised last full moon." But even here, under the moonlight, there are quirks. There was a law, short-lived, historians believe, that required ratification by scent. Yes, for certain contracts involving perfume or spice, the item had to pass a nose test by the buyer. If it smelled wrong, the trade could be cancelled on the spot. This led to some absurd legal debates involving, quite literally, a difference of opinion in the nose. As you take a seat on a stone bench, a child walks by balancing a tray of something soft and steaming. bread again. But not just any bread, ritual bread. It had to be delivered to a temple before dawn. And if you dropped it, if you squished it, well, there was a clause for that. Depending on the ritual, damaged bread might be seen as an omen. If it was too warm, too dry, or missing a sesame seed, the gods were said to turn their gaze away. That's bad. The delivery child could be sent back, scolded, even reassigned. All for a squashed loaf. You wonder how many ancient therapy sessions started with, "It all began with the bread." You lean back and glance up at the stars. It's funny. All these odd little laws about beards and bread, barter and baking, they weren't about micromanaging lives. They were about fairness. A very Babylonian sense of fairness where everyone, from the fancy bearded judge to the barley trader with one sandal, played by the same dense, maddening, beautifully lie bureaucratic rules. And as you close your eyes, the last thing you hear is a quiet scuffle between two boys over who trimmed whose sheep. Apparently the sheep now has bangs, which is definitely going to need a ruling. You awaken, or rather drift deeper into that in-between state, with your sandals crunching softly on gravel near the banks of the Euphrates. The water glimmers beneath a sleepy sky, whispering across the stones with the rhythm of secrets. But you're not here for a midnight swim, or at least you hope not. Because here, by the river, Babylon judged the guilty, not with a jury or gavel. No powdered wigs or dramatic finger-pointing. Instead, the current decided, imagine this, you're accused of theft, sorcery, or worse, blaspheming a temple goose. You protest your innocence. The priests listen, the scribes squint. Then someone unrolls a brittle scroll and sighs. To the river, then? Yes, Babylonian law sometimes called for the accused to be thrown into the Euphrates. The idea was divinely simple. If you were innocent, the gods would save you. If guilty, the river would handle it, gently or not. Historians still argue whether this was literal divine trial or more symbolic theatre, but clay records suggest some people actually swam away. Others, unfortunately, did not. Probably not a great day for them, especially if they couldn't swim. You edge closer to the water. There's an old platform here, slick with algae and memories. A few mossy statues stand crooked in the moonlight, guardians of law, or possibly just abandoned garden art. Hard to tell. One of them stares out over the river with the blank expression of someone who's seen too much justice. The strangest part. This watery trial wasn't always a punishment. Sometimes it was a proof of innocence. You could volunteer to leap in, arms flailing, just to clear your name. Some folks even hired swimmers to do it for them, though that quickly led to a law banning proxy plunging. Babylon wasn't amused. You hear splashing, probably a frog, and instinctively step back. Not tonight, Euphrates, not tonight. Across the water, a priest lights a small lantern, probably preparing for a different sort of ritual, one involving oaths and river blessings. The Euphrates wasn't just a judge, it was a witness. Treaties were signed by it, contracts were rinsed in its waters, even temple loans, yes, the gods charged interest, were sometimes sealed with a symbolic river dip. And woe to anyone who forged such documents. Babylon had a law for that too. You'd be stripped of your stylus rights, the ancient equivalent of being banned from Microsoft Word. Imagine being that one scribe who had to write everything with borrowed ink, constantly asking, "Can I borrow your reed pen for a sec? Mine's cursed." Back on the shore, an old woman drags a basket of laundry closer to the water. She hums as she washes, and you wonder if she remembers a time when the river gave more verdicts than fish. She suddenly shouts at a dog who apparently has stolen her sandal. He does not respond. He is, in fact, chewing it like a rare delicacy. You find a shady spot near a willow tree and remember something. The Euphrates had legal moods. If it flooded and destroyed your barley fields, you could sue the river. Well, technically the irrigation manager, but the blame was symbolically assigned to the waters. There are actual tablets outlining compensation amounts if the divine flood failed to be properly whispered to by the irrigation warden. Which, let's be honest, feels like a legal phrase born during someone's lunch break. More curiously, there's a fringe theory, still debated among scholars, that river trials were sometimes rigged, maybe a rope under the surface, a hidden ledge, a well-placed priest in scuba gear. Okay, not that last one. But there's suspicion, especially since certain families kept mysteriously surviving river trials while their enemies did not. You yawn. The current sings a sleepy lullaby now. Somewhere nearby, a waterbird settles into a reed nest, ignoring the laws of men entirely. And you think about all those people who once stood here, clutching their innocence, their fear, or maybe just someone else's borrowed sandals, waiting for a verdict, not from man, but from moving water. Maybe that's why Babylon needed so many laws, because when rivers speak, they don't always explain themselves. You move inland, away from the river's sleepy murmurs, and into the heart of the city, where walls of baked brick loom overhead and torchlight flickers across dusty alleyways. The air thickens slightly here, not with smoke, but with consequence, because now you're in the legal zone most famously associated with Babylon, the land of Hammurabi's code. Yes, that Hammurabi, the one whose name sounds like a pasta dish, but whose laws could make you lose a limb, literally. You pass a towering black stele, the original copy long lost to museums, but here in this dreamlike Babylon it's just there, towering, covered in neat rows of cuneiform that spiral upward like a bureaucratic poem to sternness. At the top, the king is carved in profile, receiving the laws from Shamash, the god of justice, like a kid accepting a group project he did none of the work for. Now you've probably heard the phrase, eye for an eye, comes from right here. Hammurabi's code, and yes, it's about as gentle as a brick to the toe. But what people don't realize is there were so many exceptions and loopholes and conditional phrases. You couldn't just pluck out someone's eye for any reason. You had to be the right status, and they had to be the wrong one, because the code wasn't really one size fits all. It was more like one law for noblemen, one for merchants, one for goat herders, and one for the guy who's just really bad at carpentry. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or simply a reflection of rigid social class. Either way, the laws read like someone trying to cover every possible scenario, including what happens if your ox gores a child, your son forgets to plant lentils, or your wife opens a tavern and serves someone else's husband. Let's say you're a builder, you construct a house, it looks sturdy, it smells nice, everyone's impressed. But then, it collapses. If the owner dies, you die. Simple, harsh. And if the owner's son dies instead, your son gets the penalty. That's right. The code was all about balance, in the most spine-chilling way possible. The symmetry of suffering, as one modern scholar dramatically put it, possibly while wearing elbow patches. But, and here's where it gets quietly fascinating, there were counter-laws. What if the collapse was due to a storm? What if the materials were sabotaged? What if the owner insisted on using the cheap mud bricks instead of proper ones? Then things got murky. Witnesses were summoned. Contracts were reread. Sometimes, brace yourself, people were forgiven. Yep, Babylon had forgiveness, just on a delay. You make your way into a stone corridor where scribes once sat with their reed pens, recording every judgment passed in the royal court. You can almost hear them muttering under their breath, annoyed that they're copying yet another variation of, if a man strikes another man with a pot, and the pot is owned by a third man, and it happens on a festival day, and both men are drunk, but one is also barefoot. Laws in Babylon didn't just cover violence, they covered the nuance of violence. If you hit someone and drew blood, that was different than hitting someone and knocking out their tooth. Losing a tooth had its own code number, somewhere in the 200s, if you're collecting Babylonian trivia cards. And here's a twist that makes modern lawyers weep. If you accused someone falsely and it was proven, you got the punishment intended for them. So if you tried to frame your neighbor for theft and he was cleared, surprise! You're now guilty of theft. Hope you like barley fines and public head shaving. You sit on a worn stone bench where hundreds may have waited, listening to judgments echo through the halls like soft thunder. Imagine being that poor merchant accused of shorting a silver measure. or the scribe who forgot to include the "unless it's raining" clause in a farming contract. Babylon may have been strict, but it wasn't heartless, at least not always. They even had a law allowing debt relief in certain years, especially if crops failed. The clean slate tradition, or misharim, was like ancient bankruptcy minus the credit score. And not all punishments were brutal. Some involved payment in grain, working off a debt, or simply standing in the town square with a sign that said, "I overcharged for sheep wool, I am sorry." Humiliating, sure, but also kind of efficient, ancient public shaming, now in Q&A form. You stretch your legs and walk past a small temple alcove. A priest scribbles something on a tablet, eyes half closed, probably inscribing law number 198 for the 100th time. You wonder if even he gets bored. Maybe he adds a doodle now and then, just a tiny goat wearing a hat. Who would notice? And as the torchlight flickers one last time before dawn, you realize something gently profound. Babylon's harshest laws weren't always enforced. Some were deterrents, warnings, words on stone meant to keep people in line, not actually push them into rivers or extract their molars. Justice, in Babylon, wasn't blind. She just squinted really hard and asked for 3 witnesses. You wake, or dream deeper, beneath the shadow of a half-built house. Wooden scaffolds creak gently in the wind, and the bricks under your feet are warm from yesterday's sun. The scent of fresh clay and drying reeds clings to the air, along with something else: tension. You're in a construction zone, Babylonian style, and someone is about to be in a lot of legal trouble. A man in a mud-streaked tunic wipes sweat from his brow and gestures proudly at the home he just finished. He's got everything: arched doorways, a real roof, a storage pit that doesn't smell like despair. But just as you admire the craftsmanship, a loud crack splits the silence. A single brick slides out, then another, and with a drawn-out sigh, the whole thing crumples like a stale loaf of temple bread. Everyone stares, no one breathes, because in Babylon that wasn't just a workplace accident, that was a felony. Builders in Babylon faced some of the most intense legal scrutiny in the ancient world. According to Hammurabi's code, if a house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was sentenced to death. No appeals, no safety inspections, just a very bad day. If the collapse killed the owner's son, the builder's son paid the price. If it injured someone, the builder paid damages in silver, sometimes equal to the entire value of the house. Historians still argue whether these rules were meant to be enforced literally every time, or whether they acted more as terrifying incentives to do quality work. Either way, you can bet no Babylonian builder ever said, "Hey, close enough." You step over a toppled brick and peek at the contract tablet left by the door. Every building project in Babylon came with a written agreement, engraved on clay and signed with cylinder seals. It outlined materials used, wages, delivery dates, and, most importantly, liability. Mess up the foundation? That's a fine. Use inferior mortar and the roof caves in? That's your funeral. And don't even think about faking your brick count. Babylon had standard sizes, and yes, there was a guy whose job was literally inspector of brick measurements. Try to sneak in some stubby discount bricks. You'd be caught, fined, and probably given the glamorous punishment of mud mixer for a month. And that's ancient HR for demotion with extra back pain. You wander into the rubble and notice a man picking up fragments of the fallen wall. He's muttering about lazy apprentices and cheap straw mix. He sees you, shrugs and says, "At least the roof didn't fall on a priest." You nod. That would have been bad, like oath-breaking, curse-inviting, temple banishment bad. And if you're wondering, yes, priests had special legal protections. If their homes were damaged due to shoddy construction, the penalties were doubled. Triple if the temple paid for the building. Quadruple if a sacred goat was inside at the time. There's at least one surviving tablet that mentions a goat's tail being injured in a ceiling collapse. The court ruled for damages. You sit on a stone ledge where builders once rested between hauling sun-dried bricks. Most Babylonian homes were made of clay blocks reinforced with straw. Strong, yes, but vulnerable in rain, or if someone got lazy with the curing process. Some builders tried to cheat by stacking bricks wet, hoping the dry season would finish the job. But when the rains came early, well, Hello, lawsuit. One tablet details a case where a builder used bricks from an abandoned shrine, a massive no-no. Not only was it illegal to repurpose sacred materials, it was believed to anger the gods. The home collapsed within days, and the owner claimed it was divine revenge. The court agreed. The builder was forced to fund an entire goat offering festival as penance. The goats were not consulted. You stroll past a surviving wall from a better-built home, thick, smooth, with clay seals still embedded in the mortar. These seals often carried little symbols, a fish, a star, a stylized foot. They were like ancient QR codes identifying the builder, the project date, and sometimes even boasting messages like, "May this house outlast storms." Occasionally, there were snarky ones. One tablet fragment includes the phrase, "Not my fault if the owner moves the bathtub." It seems even 4,000 years ago, builders had disclaimers. The funny thing? These laws didn't just scare people, they elevated the craft. Babylon had excellent builders because failure was literally not an option. Apprentices trained for years, sometimes under harsh masters, with a fondness for whacking fingers with measuring sticks. Materials were tracked, roof beams were measured to precise lengths, and no one, not one single person, forgot to reinforce the corners. Corners were sacred. And if you forgot, goodbye kneecaps, metaphorically speaking. As twilight deepens, the ruins seem to settle around you like old bones remembering how they once stood tall. You realize that Babylon's legal system wasn't just obsessed with fairness, it was obsessed with stability. Not just of houses, but of society. Builders couldn't cheat. Owners couldn't skimp. Contracts couldn't be ignored. Everything, every brick, every beam had to hold, because if one wall fell, so might the next. And no one wanted that, not the priest, not the builder, not even the goat. The sun slips behind the rooftops as you meander into a neighborhood where the walls whisper secrets of dowries, weddings, and legally binding goat exchanges. The city quiets, but here, beneath strings of lanterns and the rustle of papyrus curtains, Babylon's domestic life glows warm and complicated. Because when it came to marriage, this ancient society didn't just celebrate love, they legislated it. You find yourself outside a modest home where laughter spills into the dusty street. A wedding feast is wrapping up, and the smell of roasted lamb and honey cakes still lingers. The bride, draped in layers of embroidered linen, accepts a delicate clay tablet from an elderly woman with inky fingers. That's not a wedding gift, that's the marriage contract, a legally binding document etched in cuneiform outlining every term of this brand new alliance. Romantic, right? Babylonian marriage wasn't just a social bond, it was a transaction. And like all transactions here, it came with rules. The dowry, property or wealth the bride brought to the marriage was carefully recorded. Could be land, could be jewelry, could be 3 goats, and a slightly lopsided clay oven. Whatever it was, it had legal weight. If the marriage dissolved, the dowry had to be returned intact, unless there had been a very specific type of misbehavior. You shuffle over to the feast table, where the groom's uncle is gesturing animatedly with a skewer of grilled onion. He's explaining, loudly, how his son had to return a perfectly healthy goat last year after a broken engagement. Apparently the bride's family claimed the goat's bleat was suspicious. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. These things happen. And they did. Frequently. Because Babylon's laws didn't stop at weddings. They covered broken promises, mismatched dowries, and insulted livestock. There were laws for runaway brides, for unfaithful husbands, even for meddling in-laws. If a man accused his wife of infidelity without proof, he risked fines and public shaming. If he had proof, he could legally separate. But he still had to return her dowry unless she'd actively endangered him, stolen property, or, bizarrely enough, poisoned his water with dried figs. Historians still argue whether that was a metaphor or an actual trend. Further down the lane, you pass a house decorated with fresh reed garlands. Another wedding. You peek inside. A scribe sits cross-legged beside the altar, tablet in hand, ready to record every single clause. Did the bride agree to live with the groom's family? What portion of her father's field did she bring into the union? What happens if the husband takes a second wife? That one's a biggie. Polygamy, while legal, came with conditions. The first wife retained certain privileges, especially if she had borne children. Her dowry still belonged to her. If she was pushed aside unfairly, she could take her property and return to her father's house with legal backing and, presumably, a lot of sighing. And what a hat about those without dowries. Enter the bride price, a payment the groom made to the bride's family, usually negotiated with enough shouting to wake the sleeping goats. The bride price wasn't a purchase, it was more like a security deposit. If the groom bailed, he lost the money, and if the bride ghosted, the family had to return it with interest. You sit beside an older couple, arms intertwined, watching the new couple fumble through their first shared meal. The woman chuckles and says, "They included the oil lamp in the contract. Sensible, he forgets everything." You glance at the lamp, brass, slightly dented, and realize she's right. That lamp? If it was part of her dowry and the marriage ended, she had the right to take it, even if it had been in his mother's house for 20 years. The law was crystal clear. Dowry items remained the woman's property, even during marriage. If a husband sold or pawned one of them without permission, legal consequences, and awkward family dinners forever. A little boy runs by wearing a clay amulet shaped like a crescent moon, part of a tradition meant to ward off curses against newlyweds. You remember that Babylonian weddings weren't just legal, they were spiritual contracts too. The gods were called upon as witnesses. Offerings were made. Priests oversaw oaths. And if the marriage soured in particularly scandalous fashion, temple scribes could be called in to issue an annulment. Not for romance, of course, for ritual imbalance. One tablet even mentions a couple whose marriage ended because the wife's dream of a black crow was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. The ruling, dowry returned, no curses found. You lean back against a column and think it's all so human. Behind the goat clauses and barley penalties, Babylonian marriage law reads like people trying their best to be fair, to protect love with layers of rules. It wasn't perfect. Some laws were deeply biased, especially against women of lower status. But for its time, Babylon's system offered surprising protections, especially if your goat behaved. As the wedding music drifts into the dark, you wonder how many of those ancient marriages lasted. Some probably didn't. Some likely did. Some may have ended over something as simple as a burned stew or a mother-in-law who forgot to return a cooking pot. And for each of them, there was probably a law, or at least a very annoyed scribe. You shuffle away from the wedding scene with a belly full of borrowed honey bread and a head swirling with legal clauses about goats and dowries. But as the music fades and the sky darkens, another scent draws you in. A heady, rich aroma of malt and yeast drifting from a low-lit building at the edge of the street. Laughter bubbles out through its open doorway. You've arrived at one of Babylon's most bustling and dangerous institutions, the tavern. That's right, Babylon had bars. But these weren't just places to drown your sorrows or flirt with someone over fermented date wine. They were also legal minefields. You step inside cautiously, and a dozen sleepy eyes turn toward you. The air is thick with beer vapor, spices, and mild regret. At the counter stands the innkeeper, a woman, likely a widow because most taverns were run by women, and that's important because Babylon's laws treated female tavern keepers very specifically. Take a seat at the long clay counter. The stool creaks ominously. You glance down and see the corner of a cuneiform warning sign baked into the wall. Beware. The penalty for cheating in drink measures is submersion. Not metaphorical, literal. See, Babylonian didn't just regulate what went into your drink, it regulated how much. If a tavern keeper watered down beer, drowned. If she overcharged a customer, fined in barley. If she allowed criminal conspiracies to happen inside her establishment without reporting them. Really drowned. This time in a river, and likely with temple witnesses. You sip cautiously from a tiny clay cup. It's warm, foamy, and shockingly delicious. That's no accident. Babylon's beer was legendary. Brewed from barley cakes and flavored with dates, honey, or spices, it came in dozens of varieties, and it was the most commonly consumed beverage in the city. Safer than the river water. More reliable than your brother-in-law's goat milk. And legally it had to meet quality standards. The scribe in the corner raises his glass and says, "If the head of foam doesn't rise past your nose, it's not real beer." You smile politely and do not test this. Now here's where it gets strange. Well, stranger. Tavern keepers were often required to record the identities of their customers, especially if they were foreigners or temple officials. The reasoning: Babylonian authorities feared taverns might become breeding grounds for plots, rebellion, or very loud harp music. So every cup served to a suspicious guest had to be logged. Think of it like ancient Yelp reviews, except with more surveillance and slightly fewer pictures of soup. And let's not forget the sacred element. In some city districts, beer was considered a temple good. That meant certain brewing tools and ingredients were legally sacred. If you stole yeast from a priest's brewery, punishable. If you drank temple beer without permission, also punishable. If you spilled it, that was complicated. Scholars still debate whether accidentally spilling temple beer was forgivable, or if it required a full ritual cleanse and the symbolic slaughter of a clay pigeon. Back at the bar, the innkeeper is now arguing with a customer over a tab. She pulls out a clay tablet with tally marks and waves it like a dagger. 3 cups, not 2. Don't insult my math, he protests. She squints. You consider sliding quietly off your stool just in case someone ends up invoking Law 108, which states, roughly translated, if a tavern keeper fails to take payment in silver or grain and no record is made, the beer is considered stolen. Theft by intoxication, a serious crime. And yet taverns weren't all danger and barley audits. They were social hubs, especially for lower-class workers. Builders, shepherds, guards, and even scribes would gather to unwind, swap stories, and maybe exaggerate how many bricks they laid that week. Sometimes the tavern was the only place you could hear the real news. Who divorced who, which priest tripped on temple steps, and whether the high priest's pet monkey had escaped again. You lean back against the wall and eavesdrop on a pair of young men debating something involving camels, marriage, and, uncomfortably, a mother-in-law clause. One slaps the table, the other nods solemnly. They order more beer. The tavern keeper rolls her eyes and adjusts her headscarf, muttering something about fools who drink like nobles but tip like goats. It's all oddly comforting. Babylonian society may have been rigid, but the tavern was a pressure valve. Here, even under the threat of drowning laws, people could be people, loud, messy, hilarious, and occasionally wrong about everything. And for all the legal oversight, the empire needed these places. They were more than watering holes. They were gossip centers, arbitration chambers, and on one famous occasion, the site of a contract negotiation involving a runaway bull and 3 bolts of purple linen. The verdict? The bull stayed, the linen didn't. As the night deepens, the laughter softens, cups empty, tablets get tucked under tunics. You hear a final toast, to beer, and to not being arrested tonight. Everyone cheers, even the goat tied up by the door bleats approvingly. You step back into the street with warm cheeks and a slower pace. Babylon, you realize, was always watching, but not always harshly. Even in a city of laws, there was space for a little joy, a little foam, and a lot of barley. Just keep your tab settled and never water down your beer. The tavern behind you hums into silence as the clay lamps sputter out, and you find yourself walking with a sway, not from drink, but from the weight of all those laws about it. The air is cooler now, brushing gently across your arms, like soft linen soaked in the scent of river reeds and burnt incense. The city rests, but just ahead, nestled behind the priest's quarter, something stirs, the low chanting of an oath and the unmistakable clink of metal on stone. You've wandered straight into the realm of Babylon's doctors. And yes, They had laws too, perhaps the most dramatic of all. In a small courtyard lit by flame bowls, a healer bends over a patient's wrist. He's muttering prayers, but also, more importantly, calculating, not for diagnosis, for fees. Because in Babylon, medical practice was not some vague art. It was a contract. You treated someone, you got paid if you failed, you paid instead. You slide onto a low bench, watching as the healer opens a carved box of tools. Bronze scalpel, obsidian scraper, fragrant oils in delicate clay jars. He selects one and turns to a thin tablet beside him. It's not a recipe, it's a price list. Babylon had written fees for medical procedures. Set by law, broken bone, this much silver. Cut out a tumor, or at least something vaguely tumor-shaped, or that much grain. Assist in childbirth without losing the mother. Premium fee, but here's where things turn sharp. If a doctor performed surgery on a noble and caused death or serious injury, they could have their hands cut off. No appeal, no malpractice insurance, just a swift end to the career. The logic? Your hands caused harm, so your hands pay the price. It's very Old Testament, except the source is even older. You glance at the healer's hands, steady, scarred, probably terrified, but status mattered. If the injured person was a slave, the penalty was financial, a payment to the owner. If it was a merchant, a fine and a public apology, usually involving loud shouting and a dramatic bow. Historians still argue whether these punishments were routinely enforced or mainly symbolic, meant to scare bad healers into becoming careful ones. Most likely, doctors weighed the risks every time they picked up a blade, which might explain the overuse of non-invasive treatments, herbs, oils, chants, and, yes, applying mashed dates to the forehead. Apparently good for fever, possibly good for morale. A low groan comes from inside the room. The healer leans in. You peek over his shoulder and see a man gripping the edge of a reed mat, sweating through his tunic. The healer murmurs, "Hold still." He doesn't. But somehow the knife still finds its mark. A small cut, a whispered prayer, and then quiet. The healer drops a bloodied rag into a clay bowl, then dips his fingers into a small jar labeled with 3 cuneiform symbols, hot oil remedy. It smells like basil and something much more ancient. You step outside into the breeze again, where a young apprentice scribbles notes by firelight. His tablet is filled with diagrams, limbs, organs, even what might be a nervous system if you squint really hard and tilt your head. Medicine in Babylon wasn't primitive, just creative. They believed illness was both physical and spiritual. You could be sick from bad water, yes, but also from angering a household god or eating under a cursed tree. So healing wasn't just stitches and oils. It involved rituals, offerings, and divination. A sick man's fate might be read in the liver of a sacrificed sheep, or in the cracks of a baked clay liver model. One tablet even describes a doctor rejecting a patient because the signs in the goat entrails were unfavorable. You don't see that in modern clinics. Still, some Babylonian treatments were eerily effective. Honey for wounds, garlic compresses, even the early use of alcohol as disinfectant. You nod, impressed. And slightly grossed out by the part where they used crushed beetles to treat infections. No one's perfect. As you walk past the healer's home, a woman steps outside carrying a small child wrapped in linen. She smiles, nods to the stars, and whispers something about the god of health watching. You get the sense she means it, because medicine here wasn't just law, it was faith. To heal was to serve not only the patient, but the divine. And to fail? That wasn't just a professional slip, it was a spiritual one. That's why records show that most healers were also priests. They washed with holy water, they fasted before major procedures. One even refused to touch a patient until his dreams showed a falcon landing gently upon a basin of salt. Interpret that as you will. You pause by a tree, feeling the hush settle in again. Somewhere nearby, a patient sleeps without fever. A healer prays his hands are safe for another day. And a tablet hardens in the fire, its surface recording one more line. For the relief of swelling, Boil and apply willow bark. Repeat after full moon. It's not glamorous, but it works, mostly, and in Babylon mostly was legally acceptable. The healer's courtyard fades behind you, its flickering torchlight shrinking into the murky dark like a soft memory you're not quite ready to let go of. But the city has more to show you. You drift now into a quieter quarter, where homes are smaller, rooftops are lower, and the streets are thick with the scent of lentil stew, soaproot and damp clay. This is where Babylon's orphans lived, and where some of the most quietly touching laws were born. You pass a row of clay houses, their doors etched with crude little drawings. Birds, circles, protective eyes. Inside, families cluster close to tiny hearths, but not every child had a family here. That's where the scribes came in. In ancient Babylon, adoption wasn't just a charity, it was a contract, a legal, binding agreement. You pause outside a small shrine where a woman in a blue headscarf presses a thumbprint into a freshly baked clay tablet. Next to her, a boy, maybe 9, stares straight ahead, solemn. On the tablet are his new names, the adopting father's, the child's new family line, and, most importantly, the terms. Because every adoption in Babylon came with terms. The child was to be treated as a natural-born heir. They would inherit property, they would care for the adoptive parents in old age, they would light offerings at the ancestor altar, and if the child refused to honor this agreement, they could be disinherited. But here's the twist: if the parents broke the deal, say by mistreating the child or failing to educate him as promised, the child could leave, and the parents could be fined. That's right. Babylonian law gave some protections to adopted children that many modern systems took centuries to codify. You wander past a group of older boys learning to shape bricks under the eye of a strict but not unkind teacher. One of them drops a mold and yelps. The others laugh. The teacher mutters something about retraining your thumbs. You smile and step over the wet clay, thinking, these apprentices weren't just laborers, they were legal family. Adoption in Babylon wasn't limited to infants. It often involved teenagers, especially orphans or slaves who had shown loyalty, strength, or the mysterious Babylonian quality known as tablet discipline, a sort of ancient report card that tracked obedience, writing skill, and whether you washed behind your ears. The motivations varied. Some families adopted to gain workers, others because they were childless and needed heirs. Some even adopted elderly parents, yes, reverse adoption, to ensure they'd be cared for by someone legally bound to do it. There's a preserved case tablet detailing a man who adopted an old widow in exchange for her small garden plot. The agreement? He fed her, gave her clean water, and when she died, inherited her 2 ducks. Ducks included. Legal clause. You turn down a narrow alley where a girl is reciting multiplication tables to a bored-looking cat. The girl is likely adopted, the cat probably not. Her tunic bears the mark of a temple school. That's significant. Many adopted children, especially orphans, were sent to temple schools to become scribes or attendants. It was a good life if you could avoid ink poisoning and develop a taste for lentil soup with absolutely 0 seasoning. Nearby, an elderly scribe sits on a bench, tablet in lap, watching the world with half-lidded eyes. Adoption, he murmurs, is not the giving of a child but the receipt of a future. You pause, impressed. Then he burps and adds, also sometimes you get goats. Fair enough. You sit beside him and he points to a cracked tablet fragment in his bag. It tells the story of a man who adopted 2 sons, brothers, after their parents died in a flood. He taught them farming, gave them land. And when he died, he left instructions. One son inherited the orchard, the other inherited the house, but both had to jointly care for their adoptive mother. If either failed, the other would take everything. Legal? Yes. Enforceable? Absolutely. Emotional? Surprisingly, yes. Historians still argue whether these adoption laws were progressive by design or simply a clever way of keeping property in circulation. Either way, the laws worked. They ensured that vulnerable children had legal standing, that even those born with no name could one day sign their own contracts, inherit land, or, if they worked hard, become scribes themselves. You watch as a boy kneels in front of a small altar, placing a plum there. Maybe it's for his birth mother, maybe it's for his adoptive one, maybe he doesn't know, but the gods do. And Babylon's laws surprisingly made room for that kind of grace. A soft wind brushes your cheek, and for a moment, the silence here feels like something sacred. There were empires built on conquest, but Babylon, in part, it was built on clay contracts, quiet promises, and the steady, lawful adoption of futures. You leave the quiet of the adopted child's courtyard, stepping once more into the rhythm of the waking city. A rooster croaks somewhere in the distance, way too early and also slightly off-key, and a faint breeze kicks up dust across the cobbled path. Ahead of you looms a long, low row of mud-brick buildings, the kind with thick walls and courtyards full of tools and tired faces. This is the district of farmers and land tenants, and tonight you've stumbled right into Babylon's bureaucratic garden. The first thing that hits you, the smell, damp soil, fermenting dates, crushed onion stalks, and something unmistakably goat-adjacent. The second thing, the sheer volume of paperwork, well, clay work, because here, in the fertile belly of Babylon, even farming was wrapped in scrolls of law. You pass a farmer hunched over a stone slab, grumbling to a scribe. The rains came late, again, and the ox has gout, again. The scribe nods sympathetically while scraping tiny wedges into a tablet, no doubt recording another clause of Babylonian tenant law, a sprawling mess of rules that tried, valiantly and often in vain, to keep the balance between landlords and the poor souls who worked their soil. Here's the setup. Most farmers didn't actually own their fields. Land was typically the property of temples, nobles, or absentee landlords who only showed up when the granaries filled. So the average farmer leased land, and those leases were detailed. Payment terms, crop obligations, delivery dates, ploughing requirements, irrigation access, even manure distribution. And if a farmer failed to meet his quota, fined. If he claimed the weather ruined his harvest, possibly excused if he could prove it. Yes, Babylon had clauses for act of God events, floods, droughts, hail, and something described as angry winds that damage barley. If a farmer could show that natural forces wrecked the crops, he might be let off the hook. But, and this is important, he had to notify the landlord early. Waiting until harvest time to claim the squash just didn't feel like growing this year wasn't going to cue, oh, cut it. You cross into a field that's more dust than wheat now. A young man is trying to coax a donkey into pulling a wooden plough. The donkey seems emotionally unavailable. He misses the other donkey, someone explains. They had a bond, you nod solemnly. The law, you'll be glad to know, made room for animal-related drama. If your ox died mid-season, you could request a partial lease adjustment. If your tools broke due to no fault of your own, you might qualify for an equipment leniency clause, provided you reported it within 3 days and didn't just try to fix it with old sandal straps and a dream. And oh, the storage disputes. Babylonian farmers often stored grain in shared silos. This led to more drama than you'd think. A classic legal complaint. My neighbor's barley mold infected my clean pile. The court would investigate. Witnesses would be summoned. Sometimes even the weight of the remaining grain was examined to determine fault. If your pile shrank mysteriously overnight and no mice were present, someone had some explaining to do. One farmer you pass is visibly furious, kicking a dried pumpkin like it insulted his mother. His lease required him to plant diverse crops, but the beans failed, and now the landlord is demanding repayment in beer barrels. Legal? Technically, yes. Fair? That depends on your bean philosophy. And then there's irrigation law, a Babylonian specialty. Water was gold and canals were lifelines. Steal water? You'd pay dearly. Divert water without permission? Fined. Let your water overflow and drown your neighbor's fig tree. Get ready for court, fig hater. One delightful case on record involves a tenant who dug a secret ditch to drain extra water from his landlord's field into his own. He was discovered when the landlord noticed his melons were suspiciously thriving. The scribe's verdict included the phrase, "His melons grew unjustly," a phrase I recommend using in all future legal debates. You rest on a crumbling wall where someone's barley field once stood proudly. Now it's just dry soil and half a rusted sickle. Babylon's agricultural laws were rigorous, sure, but underneath all that enforcement was something surprisingly compassionate. The system allowed for failure. A bad season didn't always mean ruin. If you followed the proper channels, reported issues, kept your records, didn't insult your landlord's ancestry, you could survive, maybe even thrive. But there were lines you didn't cross, like planting on unassigned land, or harvesting too early, or claiming your neighbor's goat was clearly confused and began grazing your field because of spiritual barley alignment. Yes, someone tried that. No, it did not work. As the moon climbs above the city, you realize you've been listening to arguments about lentil yield projections for an hour, and yet you're not bored. It's oddly soothing. Babylon cared about every kernel, every clause, every complaint about moldy grain sacks. Because to them the farm wasn't just where food came from, it was where fairness grew, slowly, unevenly, but always in the direction of survival. And for a civilization so famous for laws carved in stone, their farming system was surprisingly flexible. Just don't forget to water your squash. The sky hangs dark and still above the fields now, like a velvet curtain stitched with glinting stars. But the city doesn't sleep completely. There's always motion somewhere. Always the sound of hooves in the distance, the rustle of wool, and a shepherd cursing under his breath. You follow the noise through a crooked wooden gate into the livestock quarter, where Babylon's four-legged citizens cause just as much legal drama as the humans. You step aside quickly as a frantic goat barrels past you, trailed by a breathless boy wielding a rope and what might once have been a sandal. "That one's not mine," he yells. "She followed me." Sure, kid, because in Babylon, ownership of livestock wasn't just about possession, it was about proof. And sheep theft, accidental or otherwise, was a serious business. Let's break it down. If a sheep wandered into your yard and you kept it, and then the original owner showed up waving a clay tablet with a matching hoof print, you were legally required to return the sheep and pay a fine. Claim ignorance? No dice. Babylonian law expected you to know which sheep were yours and which were freeloaders. Historians still argue whether sheep branding was standard practice or just mentioned in rare cases, but tablets do suggest that certain livestock had ear carvings, symbolic dyes, and even tiny amulets tied to their wool. One particularly poetic ruling refers to a goat with the god Marduk's eye painted upon its brow. That's either branding or the world's earliest livestock cosplay. You find yourself in a broad enclosure now, surrounded by sleepy sheep, tethered donkeys, and at least one smug-looking ox. A scribe nearby is recording an exchange contract, 1 mule for 2 young sheep and a portion of next month's grain yield. It's all very civilized until someone yells, "That mule limps," and suddenly half the yard is shouting. Livestock trade laws were incredibly specific. You couldn't sell a sick animal without disclosing its illness. You couldn't overstate an animal's age. You definitely couldn't sell someone a pregnant goat without telling them. And if the goat gave birth after the sale, there were rules about who got to keep the kid. Spoiler, it usually depended on the exact date of the transaction and whether a witness was present when the goat was visibly with goat. Contracts often included clauses like, "This donkey is healthy of hoof, sharp of eye, and unbitten by spirits." Because yes, spiritual contamination was a valid concern. If your cow acted possessed, you could return it, provided you had at least one witness and a priest willing to confirm that yes, the animal had displayed agitated chewing and unnatural mooing. And then there were the shepherds. Oh, the shepherds. A shepherd's job was more than just leading flocks around like a woolly parade. They were legally responsible for every animal in their care. Lose a sheep, pay for it. Return with fewer animals than you left with. Prepare your explanation and your barley pouch. The law was clear. Unless you could prove the loss was due to a lion, flood, or act of war, you owed full restitution. You pass a shepherd standing beside a half-full pen, waving his arms at a scowling official. I counted them before the moon rose, he insists. The official holds a tablet and doesn't look impressed. And count again, he says, and this time, leave out the imagination. To protect themselves, shepherds kept detailed logs. Yes, actual clay tablets documenting when each sheep entered and exited the flock. They even had to record whether a sheep was pregnant, injured, or particularly moody. These tablets were stored in herding stations, which acted like a bizarre mix of vet clinic, courthouse, and waiting room for woolly clients. But what if someone stole your sheep from the pen? That's where watchmen came in. Many communities hired local guards or appointed flock observers who were paid to ensure no animals mysteriously disappeared. If a theft occurred on their watch and they couldn't stop it, guess who paid the owner? Yep, the watchman. Babylon had a full loop of accountability. The owner registered the sheep. The shepherd watched them. The watchman watched the shepherd. And the scribe, well, he watched everything, especially if you tried to fudge your numbers. You reach a feeding trough where two donkeys are nose-deep in lentil mush. One has a clay tag around its neck, an early form of ID. The tag reads, belongs to Shuma Ilani, if found, return or face legal curse. Simple, effective, possibly overkill. Still, you can't help but admire the system. Babylon didn't just treat animals as property, it treated them as investments, valuable assets with paperwork, personality, and the occasional divine mood swing. And because so much of the economy depended on wool, milk, transport, and trade, the law bent itself carefully around the humble bleat of the city's flocks. You close your eyes for a moment and hear it all, the low hum of sleepy animals, the scribe's stylus tapping clay, and the shepherd's soft prayer to keep his sheep from wandering, lions from lurking, and mules from limping before market day. Babylon's laws weren't always kind, but here, among the animals, they were deeply practical, rooted in fairness, obsessed with detail, and occasionally, just occasionally sweet enough to make you forgive the donkey that stepped on your foot earlier. The livestock quarter slowly fades into silence behind you, a patchwork of bleats and brays retreating into the soft cloak of night. Ahead, the city shifts yet again. No more fields, no more flocks. Now you're in the belly of Babylonian trade, the merchant district, where wheels creak on stone, scales balance silver and barley, and behind every deal there's a rule just waiting to be tested. You duck beneath a woven canopy as two men argue over the missing corner of a rug. The merchant insists it was already like that. The customer claims sabotage. A scribe sighs deeply and starts rolling out his clay. You've arrived just in time for a merchant dispute, which in Babylon was as common as bad sandals and as legally dense as a grain contract written by a perfectionist. Trade, after all, was Babylon's lifeblood. Spices from the Indus, wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from who knows where, it all flowed through this city like gossip through a palace kitchen. And with so much movement came misunderstanding, accusations, overcharges, and the occasional accidental donkey swap. So naturally, Babylon had laws for every step of the transaction. You want to sell something? You need a written agreement. Want to deliver goods by mule caravan? Document it. Want to charge someone? Owe me one for broken jars you claim they dropped? You'd better have witnesses, and at least one with a functional memory. You stroll past a caravan unpacking crates of dried figs and feel the tension in the air. The lead merchant is visibly agitated, gesturing at a bundle of crushed pottery. The porter shakes his head. They broke during the river crossing. The merchant narrows his eyes. Then why are the fig jars intact? A classic blame game, and Babylonian law had plenty of verdicts for these situations. If a courier or transporter damaged goods, he was liable for the loss unless he could prove that the damage was caused by unavoidable forces, floods, bandits, divine pranks. Otherwise, he paid, often in silver, sometimes in barley, and once, according to a delightful clay tablet, in the form of a new set of matching jugs fired at his own expense under temple supervision. The laws also protected the buyer, especially if the seller pulled a fast one. Selling old grain as fresh, illegal. Selling dyed wool as naturally coloured, illegal. Passing off goat milk as cow milk, Not just illegal, scandalous. Babylon took product integrity seriously, especially when it involved temple buyers who could take a merchant to court and issue a curse that would allegedly make your sandals fall apart during rain. One woman passes you with a basket of textiles, muttering about last time's linen scam. You feel for her. Fabric fraud was so rampant that Babylon had weave inspectors, officials who examined the quality of cloth and ensured it hadn't been stretched, patched, or dyed with forbidden herbs. There was one case where a seller tried to pass off a rough wool tunic as silk by rubbing it with oil and cinnamon bark. It smelled amazing. It sold fast. It also got him banned from the district for a full harvest cycle. You approach a stall selling bundles of copper wire, a product usually reserved for temples or high-status repairs. The merchant, noticing your curiosity, smiles and says, "Genuine, sealed yesterday. Want the certificate?" He waves a tiny clay tablet like it's a badge of honor. It is. Babylon had an entire system of merchant licenses, and goods often came with their own written IDs. Lose the tablet? Tough luck. The buyer had every right to refuse delivery. The gods, after all, liked order, and so did the courts. But trade wasn't always local. You follow a group of scribes to the edge of the district where foreign traders gather in a dusty courtyard. Languages fly like bees, Akkadian, Elamite, something that might be Hurrian, and a few words you suspect are made up entirely. Babylon welcomed foreign trade, but it came with strings. Foreigners were required to partner with local merchants, who vouched for them legally. If a foreign trader skipped town with your payment, their Babylonian partner was held accountable. One tablet from the archives tells of a Phoenician man who sold crates of sea salt incense that turned out to be dyed sand. The Babylonian merchant who signed the contract ended up reimbursing the full amount and was sentenced to a week of labor in the temple kitchens, peeling onions with focus and humility. The most fascinating part, even verbal deals had limited protection if a witness was present and the terms were repeated aloud 3 times. This triple repetition rule was considered binding in urgent situations, especially in cases involving perishables like fish, milk, or whatever passed for cheese back then. It was usually goat-based and legally questionable. You lean on a post beside a man writing out a delivery receipt. He grins and says, "Trade is trust. Trust is tablets." Then he sneezes into his elbow and drops the tablet. It cracks. He sighs and starts over. Because in Babylon, the contract mattered more than the conversation, more than the product, more than even the buyer's eyebrows raised in protest. If it wasn't on clay, it might as well be smoke. Still, for all the fuss, Babylon's trade laws worked. They kept business flowing, prices stable, and sellers mostly honest. Merchants who cheated too often weren't just fined, they were blacklisted, marked on a city ledger, avoided, forgotten. Babylon didn't need Yelp, it had scribes. As you walk away from the market, your footsteps soft against the dust of countless deals, you realize that trade here wasn't about wealth. Not really. It was about balance between trust and proof, between hustle and honor, between the fig jar and the fine print, and always, always with a scribe watching. The market's chatter fades behind you, replaced by something softer, more careful. The laughter is lower here. The lanterns dimmer, and the smell? Less barley and goat, more spiced wine and sandalwood, with just a hint of trouble. You've wandered into the quarter where Babylon's gendered laws linger like the perfume of a whispered story. And tonight, those whispers begin in a tavern doorway with a woman who isn't supposed to be drinking. She leans against the arch, sipping from a clay cup, and meets your gaze with a look that says, "Yes, I know the law. And no, I don't particularly care." In Babylon, the rules around who could drink, what, and where weren't just about etiquette. They were etched into the code itself, quite literally. Women, especially high-born or married women, were prohibited from drinking in public taverns, not because of modesty, but because of lineage and legal inheritance. See, if a noblewoman had won too many cups and then spoke a little too freely, say about an affair, or her dowry, or a land dispute, It could threaten property lines, family reputations, and political alliances. Babylon didn't care about a hangover, it cared about who overheard it. So the law said, no public drinking for noble women. But of course, not all women were noble, and not all taverns were public. You step inside a low-lit wine house tucked beside the city wall. The walls are stained with old smoke, and in the corner, two women share a drink beside a sleeping goat. The tavern keeper nods to you but says nothing, because here's the twist. Tavern keepers were often women too. And if you're keeping track, that means Babylon had laws banning some women from drinking while hiring others to serve the drinks. How's that for contradiction? The answer lies in class and clarity. Tavern women were usually widows, former slaves, or daughters of merchants. They worked, drank, and handled money, but they weren't allowed to blur social lines. Noblewoman caught drinking here could be executed. That's not drama, that's literal law. But a tavern keeper, she might just raise the price. Historians still argue whether these laws were ever softened or bent for temple priestesses, who occupied a uniquely untouchable class. Some priestesses could own property, conduct rituals, and even serve alcohol during specific ceremonies. But they too walked a narrow path. One wrong cup, one wrong man, one whispered accusation, and everything could unravel. Outside you hear footsteps. A scribe passes by carrying a tablet marked with a domestic seal. You follow him toward the residential lanes, where Babylon's laws on marriage, divorce, and gender roles played out behind heavy reed curtains. In one courtyard, a woman is selling woven baskets. Her fingers move fast, practiced, methodical. Her husband lounges nearby, counting her earnings. You see no tension between them. But the law was clear. Her income belonged to the household. Unless a contract said otherwise, a married woman's wages, dowry, and even side businesses were legally his to manage, unless, of course, he squandered it. Well, that's when things got interesting, because Babylon didn't just box women in, it gave them legal escape hatches. If a husband neglected his wife, failed to feed her, clothe her, or respect the terms of their marriage, she could go to court and demand a divorce, with full return of her dowry, sometimes even with custody of the children, if she could prove he was unfit. It wasn't easy, but it happened, often enough to make it into the legal record. You pass a scribe reading out a court decision from a cracked tablet. The woman Ninsunu has provided 2 witnesses. Her husband refused her bread for 10 days. The dowry shall be returned. Simple, stark, fair by ancient standards, and yet gendered inequality was still baked into the system. A woman caught cheating on her husband, drowned. A man caught cheating, fined, or not punished at all, depending on the woman's status. If he cheated with a noblewoman, he might be executed. If he cheated with a tavern worker, that was just an awkward breakfast. But there were protections too. If a man accused his wife of infidelity and couldn't prove it, he was the one punished. False accusation was a serious offense. Babylonian justice didn't care how angry your feelings were. It cared about evidence. And witnesses, always witnesses. If a neighbor heard suspicious noises, that counted. If a dog barked and someone remembered what direction it barked in, that, bizarrely, also counted in at least one case. You wander toward the temple district, where a group of Naditu women, a class of celibate priestesses, walk quietly in pairs. These women didn't marry, didn't drink, and often controlled huge tracts of land. They could write contracts, own slaves, and sue people in court. Some were among the wealthiest landowners in the city. And yet they were still bound by gendered rules, couldn't leave the temple precinct without permission, couldn't adopt children, couldn't serve as scribes. Laws built them a palace and a cage. As you circle back to the tavern quarter, the same woman from earlier is still leaning in the doorway, her cup now empty, her gaze distant. You wonder how many times she's played this dance with the law, visible, invisible, then visible again. You wonder how many women whispered legal knowledge to each other beneath market tents and beside doctor, drying laundry. How many taught their daughters to memorize clauses? How many simply smiled at their husbands while keeping a separate stash of barley under the floorboards, just in case? Babylon's gender laws were tangled, some parts progressive, some devastating, some, like the ban on wine for wives, so specific it feels like someone's bad date turned into permanent legislation. And yet, in the spaces between the laws, women survived, managed, resisted, thrived, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a cup of wine in hand and one eyebrow raised at the city's rules. The alley darkens behind you, the woman in the tavern doorway now just a silhouette against the flame glow inside. You turn toward a quieter part of the city, a district of long shadows and narrow corridors where doors are smaller, often unmarked, and always watched. This is where Babylon's slaves lived, but don't expect simplicity here. The laws about slavery in Babylon were not just about ownership. They were about rules, loopholes, and escape routes, and in some cases, something that almost barely flickered into freedom. You pass a narrow courtyard where a young man scrubs clay pots in silence. His tunic is coarse, his shoulders tired. But beside him sits a small wooden box, his own. That's the first surprise. In Babylon, slaves could own property. Not land, usually, but tools, clothes, animals, even the occasional stash of copper pieces saved slowly over time. The law allowed it, and in some cases encouraged it. You turn a corner and nearly trip over a low wall surrounding what looks like a makeshift school. A boy sits on a reed mat copying cuneiform letters into wet clay under the watchful eye of an older man. He's learning, the man says, not just letters, rights. You nod slowly, because Babylonian slavery wasn't static. There were degrees, categories, and legal statuses that blurred the line between servant, worker, and captive. Some slaves were born into bondage, others sold themselves during famine or debt. Some were war captives, brought from distant lands, and each type came with different protections. Take debt slaves, for example. If you fell behind on your payments, you could sell yourself into servitude for a limited time. But, and here's where it gets quietly revolutionary, no Babylonian slave could be held more than 3 years in this type of arrangement. Year 4. You walked free legally. The law was explicit. And if your former master tried to keep you, fines, public shame, maybe even state intervention, historians still argue whether this 3-year rule was enforced across all social levels or mainly applied to native citizens. There's evidence of both strict enforcement and casual abuse. But the clause was there, written, baked into law like barley into flatbread. You hear a commotion up ahead, 2 men shouting, one clutching a tunic, the other waving a seal. You pause just as a scribe arrives. "This slave is mine," the man says. "He was born under my roof." The other shakes his head. "But he was registered to my household. I paid taxes on him for 6 years. A messy case, because household registration was a legal requirement. Every slave had to be recorded: name, age, origin, role. And if that tablet got lost, misread, or faked, chaos. There's a famous case where a man bought a slave from a distant city, only to discover later that the slave had been sold twice. Both owners had contracts. The court ruled in favor of the first buyer, but fined both for failing to properly investigate. And the slave? According to the records, he used the confusion to walk away during the trial. You can't help but grin. That's the thing. Escape was also written into the law. If a slave escaped and was caught, yes, they were returned. But if they made it to a temple and petitioned for sanctuary, they had a chance. If they could prove mistreatment, neglect, or unlawful detention, the temple could intervene. Sometimes the slave would be reassigned to temple duties, other times outright freed. There's even a tablet describing a slave who sought the mercy of Ishtar, and the goddess opened a new life for him. Not all stories ended so well, of course. Escaped slaves were often branded, chained, or punished. But the fact that appeals existed at all, that was something rare for the ancient world. You wander into a workshop where slaves and free laborers work side by side shaping roof tiles. One man, clearly older, rests in the shade. His hands are scarred, but his expression calm. "I bought my freedom 10 years ago," he says softly. "With bricks." He gestures to the rows of clay tablets lined up nearby, his ledger. Every job, every payment carefully recorded, because Babylonian slaves could buy their freedom. It wasn't common, but it wasn't rare either. The process involved savings, a witness, and an official declaration, often signed in front of a city elder or temple priest. Some even had sponsors, wealthy patrons, who freed them in exchange for loyalty or service. One law even required a man who married a slave woman and had children with her to grant her freedom upon his death. The children would inherit. The woman would become a legal widow, not property, not chattel, just a person again. You sit for a moment beneath a fig tree watching shadows stretch across the walls. The lives of Babylon's slaves were hard, often cruel, but their fates weren't sealed in stone. They could marry, they could raise families, they could save, they could hope. And while the system was still deeply unjust, the laws that framed it were not always merciless. There were cracks in the wall, small, deliberate cracks, enough to let in the light. As the city hums quietly in the distance, you realize Babylon's brilliance wasn't just in its ziggurats or astronomers. It was in these strange little legal slivers of humanity, these quiet codes that said, even you, bricklayer, slave, runaway, you have a path. You have a voice. You have value, even if it takes 3 years and 1,000 bricks to prove it. The soft rhythm of tools tapping clay fades behind you, replaced by something sharper. Voices raised, not in anger, but in that clipped, tight tone that only comes when families talk about inheritance. Welcome to the awkward heart of Babylonian law, where in-laws, stepchildren, half-brothers, and the family goat all want their fair share. You're in the residential district now, but not the cozy corners of newlywed couples or giggling children chasing clay marbles. No, these are the compound homes, generational spaces where families sprawled over shared courtyards, shared altars, and, more often than not, shared grudges. You duck under a reed awning and find a group of elders seated in a circle. A scribe stands nearby with a clay tablet in hand, nodding as one man says, "My cousin's portion includes the fig grove, but the eastern fig tree was my grandfather's wedding gift." The scribe doesn't flinch. He's probably heard worse. Babylonian inheritance law was a masterpiece of hair-splitting. Let's begin with the basics. When a Babylonian man died, his estate was divided among his sons, usually equally, unless otherwise specified. But here's the catch. Equally didn't always mean fairly. The firstborn son often received a double share, especially if he'd taken over the household duties. But what if that son was adopted? What if he'd moved away? What if he married someone the family didn't like? And that's where things got messy. You follow the conversation to a second courtyard, where two sisters argue over a loom and a cow. One claims it was part of her dowry, the other says it was a deathbed gift. Both are valid legal claims. The problem? The deceased didn't leave a clear will, and the surviving husband just mumbled, "I thought the gods would sort it out." They didn't. Babylon had specific rules for death without a will, called intestate succession. If no instructions were left, the estate passed to the sons. If there were no sons, then to the daughters, but only if they hadn't already received significant dowries. Daughters with large dowries were considered already settled and could be legally excluded from inheritance unless the court intervened. It sounds cold, but there was logic. Dowries in Babylon weren't just wedding gifts, they were investments, often including land, livestock, or even slaves. A large dowry could be worth half an estate. So if your sister walked off with a goat herd and a vineyard at marriage, you were expected to let her not claim your father's fishing rights after he died. But of course, people don't let things go so easily. You wander into a side room where a group of cousins are trying to interpret a very old, very smudged tablet. It says, "I get the eastern field," one says. "No," says another, "it says you get the lesser eastern field. That's the one with the thistles." Welcome to Babylon's equivalent of a family reading the will around the fireplace. Except the fireplace is a clay oven, the will is written in wedge-shaped script, and there's a goat chewing someone's sleeve. Now you might ask, what about the wives? Well, Babylonian law made some provisions for them. A widow was entitled to stay in the household for life if she chose. If her husband left her property in his will, she could inherit, but only manage it. When she died, it went back to her children. In some cases, if a man had multiple wives, the inheritance was divided between their respective children, leading to epic courtroom dramas between half-siblings. One surviving court record even describes a brother suing his stepbrother for hiding a second will beneath a sacred biscuit jar. Verdict: guilty, also sacrilegious. Then there's the matter of orphans. If a child lost both parents, their inheritance was held in trust, usually by a male guardian or older sibling, but that came with obligations. The guardian had to feed, clothe, and educate the child until adulthood. If they misused the inheritance, the court could step in, fine them, and reassign the estate. Babylon did not look kindly on uncles who dipped into the barley fund for personal goat purchases. You pass an older woman spinning thread near a small altar. She looks up and says, "I told my sons if they fight over my tools when I'm gone, I'll haunt them." She's smiling. You believe her. Because here's the thing. For all the contracts and codes, Babylonian inheritance law wasn't just about stuff. It was about legacy. Who got what, yes, but also why. The eldest got more because he stayed. The daughter got land because her mother asked for it. The youngest son got nothing because, well, he sold his share last year for a flute and some very bad figs. It was personal, legal, emotional, exhausting, and the scribes. They just wrote it down. You pass a stack of inheritance tablets waiting to be fired. One for land, one for a cart, one for 5 sheep and the not lazy donkey. The specificity is charming and necessary. Babylonian families didn't trust memory. They trusted clay. As you step out of the family compounds and back toward the main road, you hear one last argument behind you. The tablet says I get the courtyard pomegranate tree. A pause. It died last year. Another pause. Well, I still get the roots. Babylon, it turns out, was a place where even the roots had legal value. And if you've ever wondered why inheritance law makes people lose their minds, don't worry, it's not modern, it's ancient, with a side of goat. The sun's a vague glow behind thick temple walls now, the kind of twilight that makes every shadow feel longer than it should. You step through a tall stone archway and into the sacred quarter, where the laws aren't about land or sheep anymore. They're about the gods, and what happens when mortals get a little too casual around divine property. You're in temple territory now. The clay under your feet feels cooler here, more deliberate. Incense drifts lazily from a side corridor. Somewhere nearby a bell rings, soft, rhythmic, not urgent, a signal, not a command. This is where priests live, where rituals are rehearsed, and where even snacks have legal implications. Yes, snacks, but we'll get to that. You walk past a cluster of young acolytes carrying baskets of offerings, dates, barley cakes, the occasional roasted bird. One stumbles slightly, and the priest beside him frowns but says nothing. That's generosity, because if that boy drops the wrong offering on the wrong day, there are rules. Babylon didn't just worship its gods, it regulated the exact method and rhythm of that worship down to the last crumb. Let's start with the obvious. The temple wasn't just a place of prayer. It was a legal entity. It owned land, slaves, livestock, workshops, even bakeries. It made loans, it collected debts, it paid workers, it held contracts in its name. You could sue the temple could sue you. The gods had bank accounts, and you did not want to be late with your payment. You pass a doorway guarded by 2 carved lions, stone ones, thankfully, and see a scribe reviewing donation records. One priest mutters, 2 jars of oil missing from the northern storeroom. The scribe shrugs, then someone owes the gods a refund. That's law. If you misused temple property, punishable. If you stole from the gods, you could lose your home, your business, your freedom. One tablet describes a worker who skimmed honey from temple offerings and tried to replace it with watered-down syrup. He was caught when a priest noticed the scent was less divine. He paid back 10 times the amount stolen, and apparently was banned from ever baking in the temple ovens again. But it wasn't just theft. Babylon had rules about who could enter sacred spaces, what they had to wear, and what they were allowed to eat while inside. Let's talk snacks. You wander into a small side room where temple workers are sharing a quiet meal. Lentils, dates, flatbread, modest, clean, and legally approved. The priest supervising explains, "We eat no garlic before ritual, no onions before judgment, and absolutely no leeks on festival days." You blink. He shrugs. The gods don't like strong breath. He's not kidding. Several ritual tablets outline food taboos tied to purification. Some banned foods could invalidate entire ceremonies. If a priest showed up reeking of garlic, that was grounds for starting over, sometimes at great expense. There are even records of offerings being rejected because the baker used the wrong flour. Babylonian priests did not mess around with pastry protocol. One particularly hilarious ruling, a novice priest who brought a snack into the holy chamber. Not an offering, just his lunch. The high priest discovered this during a sunrise chant. The result? A fine 3 days of temple cleaning duty, and, presumably, the worst lunch break in Mesopotamian history. You follow a line of worshippers placing clay tablets into a wall niche, prayers and legal appeals all in one. Because in Babylon, divine intervention wasn't just a private request, it was also a legal action. You could file complaints with temple authorities, ask the gods to weigh in. In serious cases, this might even trigger an oracle consultation. Animal entrails, dream interpreters, even priests who claimed to hear the gods whispering in the smoke. Were they accurate? Were they just really good at guessing? Historians still argue about that. But what's clear is this: temple rulings had weight. In one case, a woman claimed her husband was cursed after cheating on her. She took her case to the temple. The priests ordered 3 nights of dream interpretation. The results? Ambiguous, but they ruled she was entitled to 1/3 of his estate. Why? Due to celestial disfavor. That's it. Legal decision, stamped and sealed. You pass a garden where sacred goats graze lazily under fig trees. Don't laugh, those goats had legal immunity. Hurting one could land you in court, especially if it was branded with the temple's seal. There's a preserved verdict about a merchant whose cart startled a sacred goat. The goat broke a leg. The court fined the man 2 jars of oil, 1 wool tunic, and demanded a formal apology carved in clay. The goat, one assumes, was unimpressed. You rest beneath a stone pillar, letting the cool seep into your spine. Above you, carvings show priests carrying offerings, scribes writing contracts, and, most interestingly, judges with their hands raised, one holding a reed stylus, the other a small dish of oil. Symbolic balance, law and spirit, ink and prayer. Babylon didn't separate the sacred from the civil. It braided them together into a world where a priest could serve you barley soup and also oversee your loan agreement. Where violating a fast wasn't just rude, it was a breach of contract with the divine. And as the wind sighs through the arches and the stars begin their slow turn above the ziggurat, you understand why. Babylon believed that law kept the world together, not just contracts and fines, but rituals and bread, sacred goats and whispered vows. Here, even the gods had ledgers, even your snacks had consequences, and somewhere a novice priest is still scrubbing the floor for eating onions before moonrise. You leave the temple district with the scent of myrrh still clinging to your sleeves and the faintest echo of chants trailing behind your footsteps. But the sacred hush fades fast as you enter, a more chaotic soundscape. Dogs barking, someone shouting about a broken gate, and a low, rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk of a hammer hitting something very stubborn. Welcome to Babylon's neighborhood law zone, where legal disputes weren't about marriage or inheritance or omens from goat entrails. No, here it was about the mundane things that drove neighbors quietly insane. Property lines, loose livestock, and most notably, wells. You're standing beside one now, a modest stone-lined pit in the middle of a shared courtyard. It's dry, covered, properly fenced. And yes, that's important. Because Babylon had entire laws about wells. Who owned them? Who could access them? Who was legally responsible when someone's child fell into one because someone else's goat chewed through the rope? You overhear a woman complaining to a local elder, "My cousin's cousin said I could use the Western well, but she's not here, her husband is, and he says I poisoned his dog with my bucket." The elder raises an eyebrow. The scribe nearby sighs and prepares another clay tablet. Let's break it down. In Babylon, water was serious business. It was life, currency, and legal leverage all rolled into one damp, mossy bucket. Wells could be private, communal, or temple-owned. And if a well was shared, rules governed how you used it. Drawing water outside permitted hours, illegal. Letting your ox splash around in it, illegal. Dumping used laundry water back into it, deeply illegal. That one could earn you a fine and a reputation for being unwashed in both body and soul. You walk past another courtyard where two boys are building a tiny fence around a toy well using leftover reed sticks. A woman watches them and mutters, "If only my husband cared about our real fence that much." Fences were a big deal here, not just because of nosy neighbors, but because Babylonian law demanded physical boundaries to prevent legal ambiguity. Let's say you had a tree near your property line. If its roots spread into your neighbor's barley patch and their harvest suffered, you were liable. If your vine crossed over a shared wall and someone got tangled in it during a storm, guess what? Also, your fault. Babylon had a legal principle we might call passive damage liability. You didn't have to intend harm. If it happened on your watch or on your wall, you had to fix it. One preserved case involved a man whose poorly maintained fence collapsed and let a neighbor's or donkey wander into a cabbage garden. The donkey ate all the cabbages. The verdict? The fence owner had to replace the crops and lend his own donkey for 1 week of free labor. This was referred to delightfully as donkey equity. You pass another well, this one properly walled with carved stone and a small offering shelf built into its base. That's your clue, a temple well, protected by religious law, maintained by priests, and accessible only to those who paid the proper fee or performed the right offering. One tablet outlines the ritual for gaining temporary well access: a small bowl of barley, a handful of dates, and a whispered prayer to Enki, the god of fresh water. No offering, no bucket, no exceptions. And of course, some people cheated, or tried to. Babylon had a whole section of law devoted to illegal water access. If you were caught tapping into a neighbor's well at night, or diverting water from a shared cistern, you could be fined in silver, made to restore the damage, and, according to one record, be required to guard the well for an entire lunar cycle. Imagine explaining to your neighbors that you're on well probation. And it didn't stop at water. You round a corner into a narrow alley and nearly trip over a threshold stone, a heavy block that marks the edge of one property and the start of another. In Babylon, thresholds had legal power. Step over one without permission, that could be trespassing, even if it was just to pick up your child's lost sandal. Accidentally move someone's threshold stone, that was a felony. And if you did it on purpose, you could be fined, beaten, or, according to one dramatic tablet, sentenced to rebuild the street pavement under supervision of the temple elders, who were notoriously very picky about symmetry. You pause outside a small home where a woman is placing a bowl of figs on her doorstep. "For the neighbor," she says. "His wall collapsed and broke my pot, but he sent me his best goat milk this morning, so we're square." You nod, impressed. Not all disputes needed scribes. Sometimes fig diplomacy worked just fine, but the law was always there, just beneath the surface. Babylon's domestic legal system was designed for friction, for proximity, for the inevitable chaos of people living 8 inches apart and sharing walls with people who raise unusually vocal poultry. Even noise had legal standing. If your rooster crowed too early, too loudly, or too frequently, your neighbor could file a formal complaint. If the complaint held up, you might be forced to relocate the rooster or have it removed. A court once ruled that a particularly aggressive goose had disturbed temple meditation and was exiled to the Canal District, a dramatic fall from grace for one waterfowl. As twilight deepens, you hear the evening bells calling people home. Doors close, lamps flicker, And for a brief peaceful moment the wells stand silent, the fences upright, and the thresholds respected. But tomorrow, someone's goat will trespass, someone's well will overflow, someone's vine will snake across the wall and cause yet another thrilling episode of Babylonian fence court. And thank the gods for that, because behind every grand ziggurat and every sweeping law carved in basalt, Babylon thrived on the tiny battles, the fig trees, the fences, the neighbor with suspiciously loud sheep, and the well, always the well, that just barely straddled the line. You slip back into the city's belly just as the sky deepens into something almost blue-black, streaked faintly with firelight and cooking smoke. The buzz has faded, merchants are asleep, scribes have stored their tablets. But one sound remains in the quiet, the soft sob of a woman in a narrow doorway, and the equally quiet rustle of her robe as she drops a worn satchel at the threshold. She doesn't knock, because the decision has already been made. You've arrived in the district of domestic endings, where Babylonian law turned the messy, emotional tangle of divorce into something oddly orderly, or at least tried to. Let's begin gently. Babylon absolutely allowed divorce, and they weren't shy about it either. You didn't need to sneak around or pretend your husband was missing in the war if things fell apart. You just needed to follow the rules. You pass a small administrative stall lit by a single oil lamp. The scribe there is yawning but still alert, because divorce declarations could come at any hour, especially if someone stormed out mid-supper. The procedure was surprisingly clean. A man could declare he was ending the marriage. No irreconcilable differences needed. He simply needed to say it, write it, and provide evidence of how the marriage was settled financially. If his wife had done nothing wrong, no theft, no infidelity, no goat-related schemes, then she was owed her entire dowry back, in full. If she'd borne children, she might keep the house. If she hadn't, she was expected to return to her father's home. But here's where it gets interesting. The law often sided with the wife if she had proof she'd been treated unfairly. You sit down near a small garden plot where two older women are whispering about their niece. "She left him last moon," one says. "No barley, no linen, he even kept her sandals." The other clicks her tongue. "Not legal. The priest saw her bruises. She'll win." And that's the other half of this story. A woman in Babylon could also initiate divorce. It was more complicated, but far from impossible. If she could prove neglect, abuse, or even emotional abandonment, she had a case. Failure to provide bread and companionship, as one charming legal tablet puts it. In one preserved case, a woman cited 10 straight days without food, water, or conversation. The court ruled in her favor. Her husband was fined, and she kept the house. The scribe even noted with some passive-aggressive flair that the husband displayed no interest in resolution, only in sulking. But not all divorces were dramatic. Some were just administrative. Maybe the marriage hadn't produced children. Maybe the dowry was depleted. Maybe the couple simply didn't like each other anymore and agreed to part ways. In these cases, the law required a formal statement and often a mediator, usually a priest or elder, who ensured the dowry and property division were fair. You pass a tablet drying in a wooden rack. It reads, "Namtilu and Arad Malik have ended their union. 1 goat, 2 blankets, and the southern doorframe remain with Namtilu. Arad Malik retains the grain sacks and the upper sleeping mat the cat chooses." You're not making that up. One legal fragment includes a clause about a shared cat, with the phrase, "the animal may follow its own will." Babylon knew better than to legislate cats. Further down the lane, you find another household mid-divide. A man is sweeping half the courtyard while a woman carefully moves her clay pots, one by one, out of the storage room. There's no yelling, no scorn, just division. Equal parts silence and routine, and in the background, a scribe with a stylus writing it all down. Because divorce law wasn't just about endings, it was about continuity, ensuring both parties could move on, financially, legally, and yes, even spiritually. Speaking of which, there's a small shrine nearby. You wander over. A woman lights a tiny wick and murmurs to the goddess Ishtar. Not a prayer for love, but for peace, for the clean break, for no vengeful curses or sour barley loaves thrown in anger. Just a fair ending. You sit beneath a fig tree where another couple once made their final vows. A leaf drops beside you, and for a moment you think about all the ancient relationships that came before this night. Some were arranged, some were real, some collapsed under the weight of silence. Some ended when someone chose their own future over a legal contract carved in cuneiform, and sometimes, just sometimes, the city understood. Divorce in Babylon wasn't shameful, it wasn't whispered, it was written, balanced, sometimes even merciful. Because for a society so obsessed with permanence, clay tablets, ziggurats, laws carved in stone, Babylon also understood the quiet wisdom of letting go. The fig tree rustles behind you as you slip back into Babylon's narrow lanes, the air now heavy with the scent of cooling brick and the last flickers of lamp oil smoke. But tonight, the quiet feels thinner. There's tension in it, an edge. You hear murmuring voices, hushed and fast. Someone's arguing, no fists, just words, sharp ones. A neighbor ducks their head, avoids eye contact. You pause. This is where things get dangerous, because you've entered the part of Babylonian law that few wanted to test firsthand, the rules for liars, gossips, slanderers, and false accusers. You duck into a small courtyard where a woman stands in front of two elders clutching a clay tablet to her chest. Her voice is tight. He said I poisoned his stew in the square, loudly. There were witnesses. The older man beside her nods solemnly, his stylus already tapping the edge of a tablet. In Babylon, speech had legal weight. Say the wrong thing loud enough in front of the wrong people, and you could find yourself in serious legal trouble. Not for gossiping at the market necessarily, but for causing real harm. Babylonian law recognized that words could damage reputations, break marriages, lose someone their land, or get them fined, exiled, even executed. So naturally there were rules. Let's start with false accusations. If you accused someone of a crime, say theft or sorcery or poisoning, and couldn't prove it, you risked receiving the punishment you were trying to assign. That's right. If you claimed your neighbor stole your donkey but the court found out the donkey just wandered off during a sandstorm, you might be fined for slander or worse, punished as a thief yourself. Historians still argue whether this was always enforced or used as a deterrent, but we have tablets with chilling outcomes. One reads, the man Harashi accused his cousin of temple theft. The gods were consulted. No guilt was found. Harashi shall serve the sentence meant for thieves. 3 months' labor in the temple brick kiln. Not exactly a slap on the wrist. You pass a wall where someone has scratched an insult, just a few cuneiform characters, but that's enough. Defacing property with false claims, slander and vandalism. 2-for-1 violation. If caught, the writer could be fined, shamed, or sentenced to replaster the wall at their own expense, with a scribe overseeing their penmanship. But even more delicate was gossip. Gossip wasn't illegal per se. Babylon wasn't trying to outlaw curiosity, but if what you whispered caused measurable harm, caused someone to lose a business deal, or get rejected from a marriage contract, or be denied temple access, you could be brought before the court. And it wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it. If you whispered that a woman had been seen at night by the canal with an unfamiliar man, and that woman was engaged to the city carpenter, your gossip could wreck her life. If her fiancé backed out and her dowry was returned in shame, she might sue. And you, dear gossiper, would be expected to provide proof. Eyewitnesses, exact time of night, confirmation that the man was in fact unfamiliar and not, say, her cousin, delivering lentils. One scribe once ruled, a whisper is not a verdict, a rumor does not stain until pressed in clay. You pass a clay oven where 2 women whisper between rising loaves. One pauses and looks around. It wasn't slander, she says. It was a warning. The other frowns, and that's what they all say. And they go quiet again. Babylon's law made a distinction. between accusation and testimony. Accusation was what you said on the street. Testimony was what you swore before a judge, under oath, often with temple involvement. And if your testimony was false, if you lied in court, that was bad. There's a preserved law that says if a man gives false witness and is proven to have lied, he shall bear the punishment intended for the accused. This wasn't just policy, it was deterrent. Babylon needed truth in a world of contracts and consequences. If you couldn't trust someone's word in a court, the whole legal system started to crack. But, and here's the uncomfortable bit, proving a lie wasn't always easy. Babylonian judges relied on witnesses, oaths, and signs from the gods. If there was no clear evidence, they sometimes resorted to ordeals like the river test. You remember that one? You get tossed into the river and the gods are expected to show whether you're guilty or innocent. If you float, great. If not, oops. And let's not forget curses. Babylonian law didn't enforce them, but they were part of the system. If you lied and weren't caught, your neighbor might still carve a curse into a tablet and bury it under your doorway. May your sheep miscarry and your beer turn sour was a surprisingly common one. It wouldn't hold up in court, but it sure ruined the vibe. You reach the central square now where a clay notice board stands. It holds public rulings. One tablet lists a man fined for slandering a baker. He claimed the bread was flour swept from the floor. Turned out the baker had impeccable hygiene. The slanderer, not so much. Another case, a woman falsely accused of theft by her sister-in-law. The court sided with her and the accuser had to serve 3 days silence. No speaking, no writing, no public socializing. Basically, the Babylonian version of being shadow banned. As you sit near the board, a scribe walks by and says, "The gods gave us mouths, the law gave us limits." Then he sneezes and mutters something about temple incense. In Babylon, words mattered. You could build a life with them, or destroy one. The law didn't stop people from talking. It just made sure that eventually someone was held responsible for what was said. So the next time someone leaned in close and whispered, "Don't tell anyone," but they'd better have had a witness and a really good lawyer. Dawn is still a rumor on the horizon, but Babylon is already humming again, quietly. Not with shouting or footsteps this time, but with the clink of iron keys, the soft scrape of sandals across stone, and the unmistakable rattle of a wooden gate being checked, double-checked, then slammed shut for good measure. You're in the security zone now, not some dramatic fortress, but the network of city guards, border checkers, and very tired night watchmen who kept the great city of Babylon from unraveling while its citizens slept, argued, and accused each other of onion theft. You walk past a squat building where 2 guards sit on a bench, sharing a bowl of lukewarm lentils. One yawns so wide it looks painful. The other squints at a nearby torch, mutters, "Temple-grade oil, should have saved that for festival week." You've clearly caught them at the end of a shift. Let's start here. Babylon had guards, not soldiers, guards. Their job wasn't to fight invading armies. It was to enforce curfew, check gates, record movement in and out of neighborhoods, and yes, drag the occasional loud-mouthed merchant back to his house before he got himself sued. They weren't feared, they weren't admired, they were necessary. And like everything else in Babylon, they operated under strict legal guidelines. Take the city gates. Babylon was a walled city with entry points watched at all times. These gates closed at dusk and opened at dawn, unless you had written permission from the temple or court. No late-night strolls outside the walls. No sneaking out to look at the stars or get some fresh fig juice. You wanted to leave? You needed a clay pass. One scribe's preserved note reads, "Let Asher Bel leave by the southern gate to fetch reeds for his mother. Return before the moon reaches its 3rd finger." Translation: be back before moonrise or face a fine and a lot of pointed questions. Guards logged every person who passed through. Name, purpose, what they were carrying, who vouched for them. If you tried to sneak something illegal through, say untaxed cloth or temple incense borrowed by a very bold cousin, you risked confiscation and a citation, or worse, being called to stand in court and explain why your donkey was humming suspiciously in the temple's key. You reach one of the smaller eastern checkpoints now. The gate is half open, watched by a lone guard scribbling into a tablet with one hand while eating a chunk of flatbread with the other. "Caravan due at first light," he mumbles. "With wine, maybe honey cakes, hopefully fewer scorpions." Guards were often assigned double roles, some double describes, some as tax collectors, some as witnesses in court cases. They were trained to observe, record, and report. Their word carried legal weight. If a guard saw you breaking curfew or starting a fight in the square, his testimony alone could be enough to get you fined, or worse, hauled into a temple dispute chamber. But guarding Babylon wasn't all watchtowers and barley snacks. There was also the matter of night patrols. You follow the dim torchlight down an alley where two men move slowly, checking doors, muttering names from a small list. These were the city watchmen assigned to patrol districts at night, ensuring no fires started, no taverns overpoured, and no one decided to settle a debt with a rock to the forehead. If they caught someone wandering without cause, they could demand a clay tablet or verbal statement of purpose. If none was given, detainment, temporary usually. But it was enough to make sure people didn't accidentally find themselves outside someone else's barley shed at midnight. One court tablet tells of a man who claimed he was just admiring the moonlight on the Western Canal. The guard countered that he was holding a spade and whispering to a sack of stolen millet. Guess which story won. You pause at a corner where a small guardhouse shrine sits, just a statue of a lion-headed deity and a bowl of burnt incense. These shrines were everywhere, reminding guards that their duty wasn't just civil, it was spiritual. Protecting the city meant pleasing the gods. A lazy guard could be fined. A drunk guard? Whipped. A guard who slept through a temple theft? Banished. No joke. The law demanded alertness. And yes, even guards could be taken to court. One memorable case involved a gatekeeper who took a bribe to let a merchant sneak wine into the temple district after curfew. The merchant was caught. The guard was summoned, and the verdict was swift. 3 days without food or wine and a fine equal to twice the value of the smuggled goods. Poetic, in a way. As you wander further, you pass a row of locked doors, each marked with owner seals pressed into clay. Babylon had no padlocks, but it had legal symbols, signatures of ownership. If someone tampered with one even slightly, they could be charged with attempted theft. Even touching a sealed door without permission could land you in trouble if someone was in a bad mood and the moon was rising crooked. But here's the twist. Guards were not invincible. A citizen falsely accused by a guard had the right to appeal, to demand witnesses, even to file a reputation claim against the guard's tablet. If successful, the guard's record would be annotated, discredited. It was the ancient equivalent of losing your Yelp stars. Still, for all the rigidity, there's something comforting in it all. Babylon wanted its citizens to feel safe, not with iron bars or guard dogs, but with structure, pattern, law. If the gates were locked, it was because someone was keeping track. If the watchman passed your home, it was because the system said you matter enough to be protected. As the sky starts to shift into a lighter blue, a rooster crows somewhere nearby, so is soft, distant, too early. And the guard at the eastern checkpoint groans. That bird is always wrong. You smile and step into the day, knowing that even in a city of curses, goats, and dowry drama, Babylon's quietest promise was this. Someone was always watching, and more importantly, writing it all down. The sky now stretches wide above you, finally free of its night pillow. Babylon is fully awake, but not yet chaotic. The marketplace yawns into life, and clay ovens begin puffing out the scent of baking bread and wood smoke. You turn down a side street with the intention of finding something quiet, only to hear a loud crash, followed by a long, theatrical groan. It's the unmistakable sound of a lawsuit in progress. You hurry around the corner to find two men standing over a shattered cartwheel, each insisting the other was at fault. Your ox sneezed and kicked the axle, one yells. Your cart was swerving like a drunk goat, the other shoots back. Neither looks ready to back down. A scribe is already there. Of course he is. Babylonian taught law, the rules about injury, accidents, and personal harm, was one of the most developed parts of their legal system. If something went wrong and someone got hurt, you bet there was a tablet about it. And if there wasn't, there was about to be. Let's talk about accidents. In Babylon, if your ox gored someone, you were liable. Unless, of course, the ox had never done that before, in which case the law might give you a warning. But if that ox had a record, say, known to be testy near figs, or has previously chased a priest, and you failed to restrain it, you'd be paying damages, and maybe offering the ox as a sacrifice just to smooth things over with the gods. One law reads, if an ox known to gore kills a man, its owner shall pay 1/2 a mina of silver to the family, and the ox shall be stoned. Yes, they punished the ox. Justice in Babylon was nothing if not thorough. You pass a potter's stall where shards of broken wares glitter underfoot. A child cries nearby, holding their wrist. The potter sighs and crouches down, brushing clay from the child's tunic. She fell, was chasing her brother, knocked over the basin. No shouting, no blaming, but if the parents pressed the matter, the potter might have to pay for injuries unless he could prove the child entered without permission or ignored a warning. Babylonian law had the concept of assumed risk. If you entered a space where danger was clearly marked, or more accurately, declared in front of witnesses, you were considered partially responsible for what happened next. If you walked into a construction zone while someone was tossing bricks off a roof, that's on you, friend. Duck faster next time. Speaking of roofs, you turn onto a street where a man is reinforcing the edge of his flat rooftop with a row of heavy stones. Sensible. Because in Babylon, rooftops weren't just for lounging, they were hazards. If you dropped something from a roof and injured someone, you paid full damages. If your guest fell off because you hadn't maintained the railing, also your fault. One judgment involved a party guest who tripped over a loose brick and broke their ankle. The host had to compensate them with 2 jugs of beer and a new pair of sandals. Stylish and reparative. You wander further into a side alley where 2 women argue over a leaky oven. Your fire seeped into my storage wall, one accuses. Then why did you stack hay next to my chimney? The other retorts. You'd think fire law would be a modern obsession, but Babylon had you covered. If your fire escaped and damaged someone else's property, you were on the hook, literally and financially. And it wasn't just property damage. Bodily injury brought even stricter penalties. And some were famously detailed. You remember this one. If a builder constructs a house and the house collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. But here's the lesser-known clause. If the collapse kills the owner's son, the builder's son shall be put to death. Dark? Absolutely. But this was how Babylon defined responsibility by proxy. You weren't just liable for what you did, you were responsible for your entire household's ripple effect. Historians still debate whether these extreme punishments were symbolic, rare, or enforced literally. Some think they were mostly threats meant to keep people careful. Others believe the tablets show evidence of at least some harsh enforcement. Either way, they reveal just how seriously Babylon took safety. You pass a well-tended garden now, where a woman sweeps dust from her entrance. We lost a chicken to a neighbour's wine spill last month, she says casually. Filed a complaint, got 2 hens and a jar of pomegranate jelly out of it. You blink. Was the chicken drunk? She shrugs. Licked the ground, slept for a day, never woke up. Whether or not chickens had a legal right to sobriety remains unclear, but the law was clear on spilled goods. If you knocked over someone's wine jug or smashed their pot while moving through the market, you were expected to pay restitution, value of the item, value of the lost contents, maybe an apology loaf if the seller had a temper. You return to the original scene of the broken cart. The scribe has finished his assessment. One party is fined for using unlicensed axle pegs, the other is ordered to replace the broken wheel within 3 days. No hard feelings. The men shake hands. One even offers the other a slice of date cake from a pouch, because Babylon didn't treat accidents like moral failures. They treated them like inevitable messes, ones that required cleanup, compensation, and clay tablets full of very specific instructions. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. You don't need perfection in a city this complex, just accountability. And maybe a few extra wheels. The sun now hangs confidently above the rooftops, casting slanted shadows into alleys and courtyards. Babylon stretches, breathes, wakes. You follow the scent of smoke and metal, a trail that leads to a clang, a hiss, a sudden pop that makes nearby birds scatter from the city walls. Welcome to the tradesman's quarter, where hammer meets copper, and the air hums with the slow dance of craftsmanship and liability. Here, the law isn't about love or inheritance, it's about quality control. If your chisel snapped mid-carving or your axe head flew off into a neighbor's thigh, the legal consequences were, well, let's just say Babylon didn't have a department of consumer complaints, but they did have some very detailed rules. You turn down a dusty corridor lined with workshops. The first one belongs to a bronze smith. His arms are thick with soot, his beard tied back in a careful braid. A boy nearby fans the coals, careful to stay clear of the molten edge. The last apprentice leaned in too far, the man says. Got a beard shorter than his training. But he's not joking. In this quarter, injury by tool wasn't uncommon, and when tools fail, Babylonian law kicked in. Let's start with the basics. If you made defective goods, you were liable. If a chisel you forged shattered in the buyer's hand and caused injury, you might owe silver for medical costs. If a merchant claimed your weights were tampered to cheat customers, you could be fined, beaten, or, in the worst cases, exiled from the district. Being a cheat wasn't just immoral, it was legally contagious. One fragment reads, if a smith sells a tool that breaks within 3 days of use, and the break is not due to user fault, he shall repay the full price and gift a second tool without defect. Basically, the Babylonian version of a return policy, but without the 30-day guarantee or smiley-faced receipt. You wander into a carpentry stall where a craftsman is fitting a new leg onto a stool. The last one cracked, he mutters. Sun-swollen wood. I told her it was for indoor use. He shrugs. She put it by the oven. That's not my fault. And he's not wrong. Babylonian law accounted for user misuse. If a buyer ignored clear instructions, they shouldered the burden. But if the maker didn't warn them, the law could see that as negligence. You stop at a stall selling sandals, rows and rows of leather loops and wooden soles. A woman is arguing with the cobbler. They tore on the second walk, she cries. The cobbler pulls out a clay tablet. You wore them on gravel. It's written here, for ceremonial use only. Yes, even shoes had fine print. Babylon understood that craftsmanship wasn't just art, it was contract. When you bought something, whether it was a door hinge, a scythe, or a decorative beer jug, you weren't just buying the object. You were buying the promise that it had been made well, honestly, and safely. Failure to keep that promise had consequences. A blacksmith once faced court for selling defective wagon pins. The pins failed during a merchant's trip, causing his cart to collapse and spill jars of wine into a ditch. The merchant lost his cargo and his temper. The smith was ordered to repay the wine's value plus half a mina for travel interruption. The scribe even noted the merchant smelled of vinegar and rage, but sometimes the consequences weren't financial. If a builder made a ladder that collapsed or a potter's kiln exploded and injured nearby residents, courts could issue banishment from city contracts, public shaming, or, if the product killed someone, capital punishment. It was rare, but it underscored how seriously Babylon took professional responsibility. Still, not all rulings were strict. A toolmaker once proved that a merchant's assistant had dropped a new scythe from a rooftop for fun. The court ruled in favor of the smith. The assistant was fined. The judgment simply read, "Tools are not toys." Simple, memorable. Justice in 6 syllables. You pass a die maker's stall next. Jars of brilliant blues and sickly greens glint in. Tea in the light. Careful, she warns. That one's for textiles. The other one eats fingernails. She laughs, but you glance down. and take a cautious step back. In Babylon, even dangerous goods had to be sold with clear warnings. One law required sellers of caustic oils to mark the jars and give a spoken warning in front of a witness. If someone ignored it and got hurt, the seller was in the clear. If they didn't warn, liability applied. You sit beside a basket weaver mending a broken stool. It's not the materials, he explains. It's the rhythm. You rush the weave, it warps. Warped furniture causes falls. Falls cause lawsuits. Lawsuits make bad business. It's a long chain. But that's how Babylon saw the world, a web of actions, reactions, and legal responsibility woven into every transaction. Even apprentices were bound by law. If an apprentice caused damage while working under a master, the master was often liable, unless he had warned the client or posted a training in progress token at the door. One court ruling let a weaver off the hook after a young trainee ruined a batch of ceremonial sashes. Why? The customer had waved off the warning tablet and said, "Practice makes perfect." Well, it did, eventually, but not for their wedding. You stretch your arms and let the sunlight settle on your shoulders. The tradesman's quarter hums on quietly. Axes sharpened, nails pounded, brooms woven, tools clattered, oil stirred. Here in Babylon, the hands that built the city weren't just artisans. They were legal entities, judged not only by what they made, but by how honestly they made it. Every nail driven, every pot fired, every blade honed meant something, had weight, could either hold up a roof or bring down a lawsuit. And in the end, maybe that's the heart of it all. Craftsmanship wasn't just pride, it was policy. By mid-morning, the city of Babylon hums like a half-tuned harp, buzzing with motion, imperfectly musical, always on the edge of boiling over. You pass the street where scribes sharpen styluses and merchants rearrange jars just so, each one trying to create a sense of order in a city constantly flirting with disorder. But if you think the chaos is only outside the walls, think again, because now we step into Babylon's legal black hole, the slippery, squirmy, always controversial domain of contracts gone wrong. You turn down a broad avenue and spot the telltale signs. Two men, red in the face, arms flailing just shy of contact. Between them, a clay tablet held high like a shield. A mediator crouches nearby, reading the inscription aloud. "I agreed to 3 goats delivered, not 3 goats promised," one man says. The other snaps back. "The contract clearly says upon agreement, not upon delivery." And honestly, they're both right, or wrong. Welcome to Babylon's oldest sport, contract interpretation. Let's start at the root. Everything in Babylon was written down. You couldn't sneeze in someone's direction without someone reaching for a stylus and asking, "Should we record that?" Contracts governed everything: marriages, loans, trades, apprenticeships, land use, temple donations, even funeral arrangements. Some were etched into clay, others into wax tablets or reed scrolls, depending on urgency and expected shelf life. And just like today, Babylon had its share of bad contracts, shady clauses, and conveniently lost tablets. You pass a butcher arguing with a barley farmer. "Your grain spoiled my salt," the butcher accuses. "I stored it exactly as you said." The farmer shrugs. "It was your roof that leaked." Now it's up to the scribes to decide whether spoilage responsibility was defined in their agreement. If not, the court will dig into context, past behavior, even verbal agreements witnessed by third parties. That's right, witnesses were vital. Babylon didn't have notaries with stamps, but it had temple scribes and named witnesses, often listed directly on the tablet. A typical contract might end with, "These things agreed before Shamash Bel, Netikri the potseller, and Ardu, the boy with the limp." Because if it all fell apart, those names became testimony. If you backed out of a loan, or reneged on your promise to supply sheep intestines for the upcoming feast, the court would call in your witnesses. If they confirmed the terms, your excuses wouldn't matter. One preserved contract reads, "If the merchant does not arrive at the gate within 2 full days of the waxing moon, he shall forfeit both jars and donkey." Yes, the donkey was collateral. You pass a table where a young woman is writing out a contract for bread delivery. 2 tablets, identical, one for her, one for the baker. A third copy might even be left with a temple archive, because in Babylon losing a contract wasn't just careless, it was a legal vulnerability. In fact, there's an entire law that reads, if a man claims a contract existed and cannot produce it, he must provide 2 witnesses or be judged as if the contract did not exist. So yes, losing the paperwork could ruin your whole month, or your barley yield, or your house. But Babylon's contract law wasn't just about writing and witnesses, it was about interpretation. Because, as any scribe would tell you, the clay doesn't always clarify. Say you agreed to supply oil in the season of high flood. That could mean early summer, or mid-autumn, or the 1 week in between. And if you failed to deliver on time, your customer could file a breach of contract claim. That's what you're watching now. 2 merchants fighting over what timely meant in a papyrus shipment. The seller claims timely meant within 10 days. The buyer says it meant within the same moon cycle. The court has summoned their witnesses, and just to complicate things, one of them is missing a tooth and insists he can't remember the moon phase in question. This is where Babylonian judges got creative. When contracts failed to specify crucial details, the court would look at precedent, previous contracts with similar wording, known seasonal patterns, even local sayings. One judgment included the phrase, "As the floodwaters rise, so do expectations." Interpret that however you like, and what if a contract was clearly fraudulent? Then the hammer dropped. Babylonian law was harsh on fraud. If someone altered a tablet after it was signed, they could be fined, publicly shamed, or in extreme cases have their writing hand broken. It's brutal, yes, but the logic was simple. The written word held the whole system together. Break that and the whole thing crumbled. There's one famous case where a man forged his father's signature on a land lease. The court called in a clay analyst, a scribe who compared the wedge strokes to other verified documents. "The left angle is too steep," he concluded. "This is not the father's hand." Case closed. The forger was stripped of property rights and banned from transacting land for 5 years. Modern handwriting experts? Babylon had them beat by 3,000 years. You pass a young couple negotiating a wedding contract. She wants the phrase, "shall provide daily bread and good affection." He suggests, "shall offer sustenance and respectful company." The scribe diplomatically suggests, "provisions and warmth of household." Babylon, the birthplace of legal romanced language. You settle on a bench near the temple archive, where stacks of clay tablets rise like little brick towers. Each one holds a promise, a price, a deadline, a loophole. Babylon may have had gods and kings, ziggurats and omens, but here, in these quiet rows of baked clay, it also had accountability. Because when you make a deal, the law doesn't care if your ox was tired, or the moon was late, or your third cousin forgot to pack the papyrus. The law asks, was it written, was it witnessed, was it clear? If not, well, may the gods help your donkey. The smell of roasted onions hits your nose before you even reach the square. Somewhere nearby, a woman is laughing while chopping dates, and a boy drops a jug of water with a theatrical splat. You've wandered into one of Babylon's many communal cook alleys, half kitchen, half gossip den, and you barely dodge a flying radish as it's tossed from one vendor to another. This is no royal banquet. This is the daily feast of the working class, and as you watch transactions unfold over sacks of lentils and jars of honey, you realize Babylon wasn't just a city of scribes and priests. It was a city of debt. Not the terrifying, soul-crushing kind modern folks dread, although sometimes, yeah, it was close. But debt in Babylon was a legal framework, a structure, a dance, really, between lenders, borrowers, crops, disasters, and the occasional goat-related catastrophe. You sit near a group of women trading barley loans. One measures from a carefully knotted rope, another inspects for weevils, a third marks the exchange on a palm-sized clay tablet. And just like that, a promise is made, because Babylon ran on credit. No credit cards, obviously, but a system of delayed exchange. Farmers borrowed seed in the spring, paid in harvest. Merchants borrowed goods to sell at festival, repaid after the final dance. And scribes. Scribes lent out everything from ink to favors, often with repayment demanded in kind. 2 weeks of cart pulling, payable in cool season. Let's look at the structure. A typical loan contract stated the amount loaned, grain, silver, oil, or goods. The interest, yes, Babylon had interest, often around 20% for silver, sometimes less for grain. The repayment deadline tied to a seasonal event, like before the barley turns golden, or by the third full moon after planting. The collateral, if any. Collateral could be a piece of land, a donkey, a loom, or even a person. Yep, Babylon allowed for debt, servitude. If you couldn't repay a loan and had nothing to give, you could offer temporary service, usually a few months, never meant to be permanent. But still, it meant being someone's labourer, cleaner or courier until your debt was cleared. You pass a tailor's workshop where a man works silently, head down. A woman nearby whispers, "He borrowed too much silver to open that shop. Couldn't repay last season. His brother lent him labour to cover it." Not judgmental, just fact. The system had rules, though. Debt bondage couldn't last more than 3 years unless renewed voluntarily. Children couldn't be taken for debts, and interest couldn't be applied during famine years, a law that saved many from lifelong ruin after floods or droughts. And here's where it gets really interesting. The king could cancel all debts. Seriously, at the start of a new reign or after a massive crisis, a king might declare clean slate law. All debts forgiven, all contracts voided. It was called Mishharum, and it was both merciful and strategic. What better way to win loyalty than to erase everyone's bar tabs? Historians still argue whether these declarations applied evenly or mostly helped the elite. But tablets exist showing farmers literally dancing in the streets. Okay, the tablet says, "rejoiced with wine and clapping," but close enough. You find a vendor who's just loaned out a batch of dried fish. She records it with an impressively detailed tablet. Amount, salt level. Expected return value in sesame oil. "He'll bring me half a jar at moonrise," she says, "and the rest when his cousin comes back with the donkey." Trust-based, yes, but legally binding. And trust didn't mean blind. Babylonian lenders were cautious. Many contracts involved guarantors, a third party who agreed to pay if the borrower defaulted, if the debtor fled. The guarantor was on the hook. One judgment reads, "Since Taram Nana has vanished beyond the wall, his uncle Idin Marduk shall repay the agreed 3 measures of silver. The gods bear witness." Ouch. Always check your nephew's travel plans before co-signing. You pass another scene. A boy returning a tool loan, a bronze sickle. He hands it back to the blacksmith, who inspects it for damage, nods, and stamps a clay token. Returned in sound state. Babylon tracked everything. Even hammers had legal histories. But what about loan sharks? Surely someone abused the system? Oh, definitely. Predatory lending existed, and the law cracked down hard. Charging excessive interest was grounds for fines, public shaming, or having your lending license, yes, they had those, revoked. In one court case, a lender charged 60% interest on an emergency grain loan. The court not only reversed the deal, it sentenced the lender to 7 days temple labor. Shady interest rates make poor offerings, apparently. And still, debt was normal. Expected, managed. You sit beneath a clay wall scrawled with market slogans. Purest wool, best honey, honest weights. And next to it, a small etching. "My sister borrowed bread and gave joy. Let no scribe forget this." Not legal, just emotional. But in Babylon, even joy had a ledger. So the next time someone says, "money makes the world go round," remind them Babylon already knew. And it didn't just go round, it was written, signed, witnessed, and enforced, preferably before the barley turned gold. You wander through a shaded corridor now, lined with hanging vines, and the faint, earthy scent of dust mixed with something floral, maybe crushed date blossoms, or the faint memory of last week's festival garlands. The city seems to pause here. The shouting merchants, the bickering scribes, even the wandering goats, all seem to quiet as you step into a different kind of Babylon. You're not in a marketplace, you're not near a temple. You're near the courts, not a grand marble building, mind you. Babylonian courts were often tucked behind temple complexes or wedged between government archives. No raised platforms, no powdered wigs, but plenty of clay, plenty of judges, and more than enough arguments. A boy runs past you, carrying 2 scrolls and a jug of water, probably late for a hearing. His father yells something about "don't forget the oath seal," and suddenly you remember Babylon didn't begin trials with "do you swear to tell the truth?" Instead, they asked you to swear in the name of a god. Because here, lying under oath wasn't just a civic offense, it was spiritual treason. You sit on a low bench outside one of these courtyards where 2 men face each other silently while a scribe preps his stylus. One of the men mutters a prayer to Shamash, the sun god and divine judge, and then points a shaky finger at the other. It's going to be a long morning. Let's rewind for a second. The Babylonian legal process was surprisingly advanced. You didn't just throw accusations and hope for thunderbolts. You needed evidence, witnesses, and, if you were lucky, an unbroken contract. Disputes were usually heard by judges appointed by the state, or more often, elders from the local district. If it was a religious matter, say, an accusation of temple theft or sorcery, it might be tried directly by priests with input from divine omens, animal entrails, or dreams recorded by specialists. Yes, even sleep had a legal purpose. You peek into one court and see a man holding up a shredded tunic. He's suing his neighbor's dog, or more accurately, suing his neighbor for the dog. Babylonian law didn't recognize animals as legal entities, but their owners were absolutely liable. This man wants 2 tunics and a public apology. He might actually get it. The process typically followed a rhythm, accusation, made publicly, often in a square, followed by a formal petition to a scribe or priest. Summoning the accused was given a set time to appear. Oath. Both parties swore by a god that they were telling the truth. If someone refused, they were assumed guilty. Bold choice. Testimony. Witnesses were questioned. Contracts were read aloud, sometimes multiple times if the judge suspected someone was creatively interpreting the symbols. Judgment, delivered verbally, then recorded in clay. And here's a fun fact. Babylonian courts weren't just for crime and punishment. They also settled philosophical debates. There's a record of a case where 2 men disputed the ownership of a ghost. One claimed it haunted his house, the other insisted it followed him from Ur. The court ruled, neither man shall summon the spirit, both shall perform appeasement rites, the ghost shall choose. Technically absurd, spiritually airtight. Back in your courtyard, a woman steps forward now, head high, voice clear. She accuses her brother of withholding her share of their father's vineyard. The judge raises an eyebrow. Was there a written will? She nods, produces a tablet. The room hushes. The scribe leans in. The judge murmurs, the old and all that lies beyond the gate clause. Vague, but legally binding. Inheritance disputes were common, especially when land or slaves were involved. Babylonian families could be large, blended, and stubborn. If a father didn't write a clear will, infighting was almost guaranteed. One court case ended with a vineyard being divided so specifically that one heir received 2 rows of vines plus the corner where goats rest. Another case awarded a house to a widow, but not the oven inside it, which remained the property of her late husband's cousin. Because of course it did. You notice something else now. The crowd gathered near each case. Not just family or friends, but neighbors, other scribes, and a handful of curious children. Court wasn't private. It was public theatre. A place where reputations rose and fell. A forum for gossip, learning, and, yes, justice. Even punishment had public elements. A man who lied under oath might be branded. Another might be ordered to walk the district barefoot holding a tablet that described his failure. Humiliating? Sure. But also strangely poetic. Babylon didn't always need lashes or prison cells. Sometimes, shame was enough. You step into a cooler corridor where clay shelves line the walls. Now these are the legal archives, rows of tablets organized by subject, year, and sometimes the name of the moon under which they were written. Everything was preserved, even the weird cases, like the man who claimed his neighbor's rooster had summoned a demon, or the boy who sued his uncle for giving him a defective slingshot. The uncle countersued for disrespect. The court fined both and gave the slingshot to the temple for good measure. Babylonian law wasn't always fair. It favored landowners, elders, men, but it wasn't arbitrary. It had systems, loopholes, precedents. And most of all, it had a sense of memory. Every case became a lesson, every clay ruling became a warning, a reference, or a punchline. You leave the courts just as a new hearing begins. A woman walks in holding a bundle wrapped in goat fur. "This is the dowry he refuses to return," she announces. The judge sighs. "Again with the goat furs." Some things never change. By now the sun is high, the streets hazy with heat. A soft shimmer lingers over the rooftops as you duck beneath a faded awning, seeking shade, and maybe just a bit of peace. But Babylon has no quiet corners, only new flavors of noise. This time, the sound is melodic, chanting, drumming, the low, rhythmic breath of a horn carved from antelope bone. You've stumbled into a ritual space where music bleeds into law and religion becomes regulation, because in Babylon, not everything was written in clay. Some rules were spoken, sung, or burned into incense smoke. Here begins your descent into the legal realm of temples and taboos, the soft power that shaped daily life not with fines and contracts, but with divine pressure, sacred vows, and very real consequences for offending a god. You sit near the outer edge of a temple courtyard where a group of young women swirl in slow, synchronized steps. They're acolytes of Gula, the goddess of healing. Their robes, shimmer with stitched symbols, eyes, snakes, and stars. Each one a quiet promise. Tread carefully here. The high priest nearby watches you from the corner of his eye. Not unkindly, just alert, because temples weren't merely places of worship. They were centers of law, power, wealth, and spiritual bureaucracy. Let's be clear, Babylonian religion wasn't just faith, it was infrastructure. Temples owned land, managed storehouses, employed scribes, issued loans, served as banks, schools, and sometimes courtrooms. You could pray at one altar and get sued in another room moments later. If you borrowed grain from a temple and failed to repay it, the priesthood could drag you into court, demand restitution, or even curse your household legally. And yes, that curse would be recorded, something like, "Let his pots crack, his goats sour, and his sandals never sit right," which honestly is one step removed from modern customer reviews. But Babylon's temple law wasn't just about punishment, it was about behavior, conduct, ritual. There were whole sections of law, some formal, others whispered, that governed how you moved, spoke, and even dressed within temple space. Forget to wash before entering? Fine. Touch the sacred basin without permission? Bigger fine. Speak aloud during the moon sacrifice? Congratulations, you've now offended Sin, the moon god, and will likely need to donate a jar of honey or a silver ring to make amends. Historians still debate how strictly these temple rules were enforced. Some argue they were more about ritual purity than real-life consequences. Others point to specific court cases where temple guards detained offenders and priests demanded compensation, sometimes in the form of public apology rituals. You pass a small chamber where a man kneels beside an oil lamp. His head is shaved, his hands trembling. He's here on vow duty. Maybe he made a promise to a god, something like, "If my child recovers, I will donate 10 jugs of wine and fast for 3 days." The child recovered. Now he's here, starving gently under the eyes of divine accountants. Breaking a vow wasn't just bad manners, it was legal fraud, especially if your vow had been made publicly. Some vows were witnessed by temple scribes and sealed into clay. Break that promise, and not only would the god get grumpy, the local court might get involved. The penalty? Loss of goods, reputation, and sometimes a temporary ban from temple access. You'd be spiritually blacklisted. But temples weren't just stern spaces, they offered legal refuge. Fugitives could sometimes claim temporary sanctuary within temple walls. It wasn't always honored, especially if the crime was serious, but in minor cases the priests might negotiate a peaceful resolution or act as neutral mediators. You pass a shrine dedicated to Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and very spicy legal contradictions. Ishtar's cult had its own internal rules. Acolytes couldn't marry. Offerings had to include salted fig paste during summer months. Anyone entering her shrine intoxicated had to remain until sober, a practice that led to some very awkward sleepovers, and of course, Babylonian law covered impersonating a priest. Yes, that was a crime. A man once posed as a healer priest to charge silver for fake blessings. When caught, the judgment read, "Let his tongue be darkened and his sandals taken." Rough. But religious law extended into daily choices too. Food, cleanliness, festivals, all came with sacred regulations. One law forbade baking goat meat in temple ovens unless it was part of a registered sacrifice. Another warned against naming a child after a god without divine approval. You couldn't just call your baby Marduk and hope for the best. Even naming a cat after a god could be considered irreverent. There's an actual record of a woman being scolded for referring to her cat as Lady Inanna. The priest's response? Cats are not divine, though they do act like it. You pause beneath a mural painted with holy symbols. A boy nearby is lighting incense with shaking hands. He's probably been caught stealing and told to perform penance rituals. Babylon often blended civic law and temple discipline. If the court didn't punish you harshly, the temple might ask you to clean altars or chant sacred texts for a week straight. Spiritual punishment didn't leave scars, just muscle aches and intense guilt. You exit the temple area and spot a small cart bearing a single tablet. The inscription? A reminder from the temple of Shamash. The gods see all, but they especially see late tithes, because yes, even donations were tracked. Required offerings varied by season, profession, and social status. If you skipped your temple tax, you could be fined, or worse, publicly named on a list of slackers posted at the gate. But don't be fooled by the pressure. People loved their temples. They brought food, dance, music, offerings. They felt comforted by the structure, just like they did by the laws. Babylon's spiritual rules weren't chains, they were signposts, gentle nudges toward decency, respect, and, when in doubt, a jar of beer for the goddess. Because sometimes the safest legal advice was this: when in Babylon, don't lie to the gods. The temple bells fade behind you, replaced now by a softer sound. Children playing in the distance, someone sweeping a courtyard, the faint clink of a cup being placed gently on a windowsill. Babylon is slowing down, even if just for a moment. Afternoon heat presses on the walls like a warm, lazy hand. You find yourself wandering into a shaded alley where small homes press shoulder to shoulder, doorways painted with streaks of color and clay lions to ward off misfortune. These are residential blocks, the real Babylon, the lived-in spaces where pots clatter, slippers shuffle, and laws are complicated, because here, beneath the ziggurats and beyond the markets, Babylon's most confusing laws played out not in courtrooms but in courtyards, kitchens, and between neighbors who shared too many walls and not enough patience. Welcome to the domestic dramas of ancient Mesopotamia. You pass a woman yelling at a boy who's just knocked over a jar of pickled leeks. He scurries into a doorway, muttering apologies, while she mutters something far less polite. And you wonder, not for the first time, how Babylon managed to legislate indoor life. Turns out they really tried. Let's start with noise complaints. Yes, Babylon had them. If your neighbor held a rowdy party and spilled beer on your woven mat, you could lodge a complaint. If their goat bleated non-stop through the night. Same thing, one clay judgment reads, if the neighbor disturbs the sleep of others with feasting, shouting, or drum play, he shall provide 1 jar of wine and fix any damaged linens. The law didn't stop fun, it just made sure you paid for the fun-induced damages. You pass a group of girls playing with pebbles arranged into shapes, a guessing game mixed with basic counting. One stops, frowns, and says, "That's cheating." You smile. Even children had unspoken rules, tiny echoes of the bigger ones all around them. Inside these homes, families dealt with their own mini-contracts. A brother promised to care for his sister's child in exchange for a portion of grain. A mother gifted a loom to her daughter on the condition that it be used to weave garments for temple offerings. These agreements weren't always written, but they carried weight. If broken, a family member might appeal to the local court, or, more awkwardly, to the family matriarch, who likely remembered everyone's crimes since birth. You step around a water jug and spot two women arguing across a shared wall. "That's my tree," one says. "Its roots are under my bath pit," the other fires back. Babylon had a law for that too. If the roots of one's tree damage the house of another, the owner of the tree shall trim them and provide 1 shekel's worth of plaster. And yes, people actually went to court over roots, chickens, even the direction of drain water. Babylon was a city of close quarters. Living cheek to cheek meant that even a cracked roof tile could lead to months of legal headaches. There's a story about two men who shared a latrine. One claimed the other wasn't cleaning it properly and demanded a division of the chamber. The court ruled in favor of the partition, with a clause requiring both parties to take turns maintaining the new wall. Problem solved. Sort of. Inside homes, rules became even more personal. Let's talk inheritance fights. If a parent died without a will, their belongings were supposed to be divided equally among children. But if one child had stayed to care for them in old age, that child could petition for a larger share, especially if they'd sacrificed opportunities to do so. Historians still argue whether this preference was enforced citywide or only in wealthier homes, but the clay tablets are clear. Caregiving mattered. You hear a faint clatter behind a doorway, a pair of young men, perhaps brothers, arguing over a grain chest. One wants to sell it, the other insists it's sacred because it held their father's offerings. There may not be a written contract, but there's something just as strong in Babylon: reputation. Family members who broke trust could find themselves socially punished, refused help during planting season, excluded from family rituals, even ignored at festivals, which, in a culture that prized togetherness, was devastating. You spot a small rooftop garden, rows of herbs, even a fig tree peeking over the parapet. Babylonian roofs weren't just for sunbathing, they were functional, shared spaces. If a neighbor's cooking smoke ruined your laundry, you had a case. If their grain bins attracted rats to your upper-level pantry, also a case. There's even a judgment that reads, if one's rooftop pigeons soil the barley of another, the pigeon keeper shall pay in kind and cover the cost of cleansing. So yes, poop law. But domestic law wasn't just reactive, it protected the vulnerable too. Babylon had rules ensuring that widows could remain in the home after their husband's death, even if the property technically passed to sons. Daughters who weren't married by a certain age could sometimes claim independent property rights, especially if they were temple workers. And if a family member suffered illness or disability, courts often required other relatives to provide support, not just out of kindness but by law. You pass a house with red markings near the door, a sign that someone inside recently gave birth. There's a quiet set of guidelines for such homes: noise to be minimized, certain prayers offered, water provided if needed. It wasn't formalized in every case, but it was enforced by community expectation and backed up, when needed, by neighborhood elders. And finally, the most fragile rule of all: don't gossip too loudly. If someone spread a false rumor that damaged another's reputation, especially about infidelity, theft, or temple misconduct, they could be fined, publicly shamed, or even sentenced to a temporary exile from their residential block. Babylon didn't have Twitter, but it definitely had trolls. You find a bench beneath a painted window and sit. A breeze kicks up, lifting the smell of lentils and drying bricks. A young girl walks by carrying a basket of figs. She sees you, pauses, then offers one. No charge, just courtesy. Because despite the tablets, fines, and root-trimming laws, Babylon's domestic peace relied on something older than clay: shared space, shared lives, shared rules, even the unspoken ones. The sun has tilted west now, its light thicker and golden, brushing the city's walls like a slow exhale. You pass through a narrow lane where shadows stretch long across the stone, and suddenly, just ahead, you spot it: a small oven, domed and cracked, with smoke curling lazily into the sky. It's not much: a few stones, a clay lid, some soot, but it has a story. Because once upon a time in Babylon, a man tried to steal someone's bread oven, and the law didn't just notice, it responded. Welcome to one of the strangest entries in Babylon's legal archive, the laws protecting appliances. You crouch beside the little oven, watching as an old woman pulls out flatbread with a clay paddle. She hums softly. Her dog snores nearby, and you realize this oven is more than a tool. It's livelihood, warmth, survival. And in Babylon, it was protected like property, sometimes even like a person. Let's start with the basics. If someone damaged your oven, either by moving it, using it without permission, or bumping it during a rooftop party gone wild, they were liable. Ovens were heavy, fixed, and fired up for hours at a time. Ruining one wasn't just annoying, it could endanger your winter food supply. One preserved law states, if a man damages the oven of another, he shall repair it in full, or replace it with a new oven of equal breadth and stone. Yes, they measured oven breadth, and there's more. Ovens had boundaries. If your oven's heat cracked your neighbor's wall, you had to fix the wall. But if their wall was already cracked, and your oven just accelerated the damage, they were responsible. Babylon loved nuance. But wait, it gets stranger. A man once built a new oven on his rooftop without telling his downstairs neighbor. The heat warped the ceiling beams, and the family below woke up to a very warm, very dangerous surprise. The case went to court. The judge ruled, let the oven be removed and rebuilt 3 cubits from the edge. Let no heat pass beneath without consent. 3 cubits, about 5 feet. That's Babylonian zoning law. You pass a row of homes now, some with ovens built right into their courtyards. One man is patching his oven's lid with fresh clay. Storm cracked it last night, he says. If it collapses on someone, that's my fault. He's not wrong. Appliance-related injuries were legally actionable. If your oven lid caved in and burned someone, or if your chimney crumbled during use and injured a guest, you were responsible for medical costs and often a fine in silver or grain. Unless, of course, the injury occurred because someone ignored a warning. Babylonian law adored context. Here's a real judgment. The boy was told not to sit near the open fire. He sat, his sandal burned. The owner of the oven shall pay for the sandal, but not the foot. A little cold, maybe, but precise. And ovens weren't the only protected item. Millstones, grain bins, brewing vats, all had similar legal shields. Damage one and you owed compensation, sometimes plus an extra inconvenience fee. Because Babylon understood that tools weren't just possessions, they were part of someone's survival web. You pass a brewing stall where 2 women argue over a broken vat. One accuses the other of overfiring, causing the clay to crack. The second says the vat was flawed from the start. A scribe is already scribbling notes. The case will likely hinge on whether the vat had been inspected. Yes, Babylon had craft inspectors, and whether proper firing times were followed. Even usage hours could be regulated. In some shared living spaces, tenants agreed to designated oven time slots. Miss your window, and you had to wait until the next day. One court case involved a man who used the oven during a neighbor's slot. The judge fined him 2 loaves of bread and made him clean out the ash for a week. That's Babylon's idea of restorative justice. Bake and sweep. But perhaps the oddest part, you could name your oven, not legally required, but some did. One tablet references Lugalbake or King of Bread, an oven blessed during a festival and painted with protective glyphs. Another was named Hot Belly, which honestly feels both affectionate and slightly unsettling. Names gave these tools personality, even a kind of soul, which makes the laws protecting them feel less ridiculous. These were not mere utilities. They were daily companions. They baked your bread, dried your herbs, warmed your winter stew. Losing one could unravel your household rhythm. And stealing one? Well, that's where it gets dramatic. A man once stole an oven from a widow while she was at temple. Not just parts of it, the whole oven, stone by stone. He claimed it had been abandoned. The case went to trial. The judgment? An oven cannot walk, therefore it cannot be abandoned. Let the stones be returned. Let the man provide bread for the widow for one cycle of the moon. Poetic, brutal, fair. You watch now as a girl brings a tray of dough to her grandmother. Together they press flatbread, then feed it into the glowing mouth of their oven. The smell rises, familiar and sacred. The oven crackles, sighs, holds their story in its heat. Babylon may be a city of codes and contracts, but in quiet corners like this, the law becomes something gentler. Not punishment, not fear, just protection. For the things that help you live, help you feed others, help you survive winter nights and summer hunger. So next time you preheat your oven, pause a moment. You're carrying a tradition older than kings. And somewhere in the ancient dust of Babylon, a clay tablet still whispers, "Respect the bread maker, respect the oven, they have their own laws." The sky is deepening now, soft lavender melting into slow brewing indigo. Shadows stretch longer than walls, and every sound takes on a gentler tone, quieter footsteps, slower conversation. Even the goats seem to sigh instead of bleat. You make your way toward the edge of the city, where the noise thins out and the river bends back into view. Out here, under scattered palms and low shrubs, Babylon's laws feel different. Less about trade, more about trust. Because here, at the city's edge, we step into the realm of promises not made in writing, but in breath, in glance, in quiet agreement. Tonight, you'll explore Babylon's unwritten laws, the customs, expectations, and everyone knows rules that filled the spaces between the carved ones. And there were many. Take, for example, the rule of water sharing. Officially, the canals and ditches were regulated by local irrigation overseers. But in practice, farmers near the end of a water line depended on neighbours upstream to release enough flow for everyone. There wasn't always a contract, just a look, a nod, and, hopefully, a mutual respect. If someone broke that trust and hoarded water, sure, you could report them, but usually they were handled by community elders or, in more dramatic cases, a midnight shovel party that quietly removed their canal bricks. No court, just consequence. You pass a trio of shepherds sitting in a circle, finishing their evening meal. They joke about a man who let his sheep wander too far and had to spend a week repairing a neighbour's fence. Not because of a fine, there wasn't one, but because that's what's done. Everyone knew it. Babylon's laws may have been carved into clay, but its heart was built on custom, like the rule that said if you borrowed your cousin's ox cart and returned it muddy, you owed her beer, not legally, but spiritually, emotionally. If you skipped that beer, she'd remind you at every harvest festival for the next decade. Or the rule of first shout in the market. If someone shouted dibs on a merchant's basket before you reached it, you backed off. Not because the law demanded it, but because the street would remember. These social contracts were stronger than any judge. If you were known to cheat, lie, skip out on shared duties, you'd find your oven mysteriously ignored during feast days, or worse, you'd be assigned the worst chore of all, night watch duty in the reed swamps, mosquitoes, frogs, snakes, endless damp sandals. There's even a tablet where a man complains not of being fined or punished, but of being excluded from a temple bake-off. The worst disgrace imaginable. Being left out of the sacred honey cake competition. Unwritten laws governed hospitality too. If a traveller passed through your gate before sunset, you were expected to offer water and food. Maybe not your best lamb, but at least a seat and a cool drink. Refuse hospitality too many times and your own neighbours might accidentally forget to invite you to funerals or marriages. Babylonian ghosting. And there were rules for reconciliation, unwritten but clear. If two neighbours fought, they were expected to send peace offerings through third parties, a jar of dates, a folded blanket, a loaf of bread wrapped in fig leaves. If the gift was accepted, the feud was over. If it was returned, well, better reinforce your roof tiles. You pause near a half-built shelter where a man nails palm boards to a frame. "Lost my home to the flood," he says, "but 5 neighbours came without asking." He gestures to the boards, the rope, the sack of nails, no contracts, just community code. Historians still argue whether these customs were universally respected or enforced only in wealthier districts. Some believe they were more common in smaller villages than in Babylon's central wards, but everyone agrees social cohesion had teeth. Even visiting merchants had to learn these rules. There's a preserved letter from a scribe in Mari to his cousin in Babylon that reads, "Do not forget to gift the oven woman a trinket. She warmed your barley cakes last time. She will spit in them this time if you don't." Charming. You walk now beneath a grove of date palms, the breeze lifting their fronds in slow applause. You notice a small shrine, a stack of stones, a bowl, and a few dried figs. Not official, not temple-sanctioned, just a neighborhood shrine, likely watched over by the elders and swept each morning by someone whose name nobody remembers. It's said that if a child was caught lying, their parents would bring them here to whisper apologies to the stone, not for legal reasons, just to teach respect. You remember the phrase a priest said earlier, "Clay remembers what men forget." But out here, you realize it's the people who remember. They remember who helped during the drought, who sent wine during childbirth, who stayed up during fever nights. No need for contracts, just memory and consequence. You reach the riverbank again, where reeds bow low and fish flick silently beneath the surface. The city hums behind you, soft and distant now, and you think about how laws can be everywhere, even where no stylus has scratched, no tablet has been fired, in shared baskets, in tired glances, in a gift left on a doorstep with no name but perfect timing, because in Babylon the most powerful law of all might have been the one nobody ever wrote down. The city is quiet now, not silent, not yet, but winding down. Even the ziggurat, towering and ever watchful, seems to exhale in the dimming light, its bricks fading from gold to clay, then to shadow. You step gently through the northern quarter, past shuttered stalls and sleeping animals, past scribes folding up their reed pens and sweeping away the day's dust from their ledgers. There's a lull here, a hush, as if Babylon itself, this city of laws and letters, knows that evening is sacred. It's fitting that your last stop is here, the legacy of Babylon's laws, the afterglow, the why it all mattered. Because yes, they were quirky, sometimes harsh, sometimes weirdly obsessed with goats. But Babylon's legal codes, those tablets stacked in archives, buried in ruins, preserved against time, were not just rules. They were a promise that even in the chaos of markets, storms, betrayal, and broken ovens, people would try, really try, to live with some kind of order, some kind of fairness, a way to settle things without spears or sandals to the face. You pause beside an old archive wall, still half standing after centuries of sun and wind. You run your fingers along the clay bricks where scribes once leaned and gossiped and laughed and maybe, just maybe, drafted a law about who gets the goat if two neighbors claim it sneezed on their porch. That's the thing. Babylonian laws weren't cold. They were funny, sometimes petty, sometimes beautifully human. They didn't always work, but they tried. And in doing so, they left something behind. The idea that justice could be systematic, that fairness could be taught, that even in a world full of superstition, floods, and occasional lion attacks, people could find ways to say, "This is what we do when things go wrong." You find one last mural near a sleeping dog and a stack of firewood, faded, chipped, but still legible. It shows a woman and a man shaking hands, a judge beside them, a child watching. It's not flashy, but it is hopeful, because Babylon knew something we sometimes forget. Law isn't about punishment, it's about peace. Peace between neighbors, between families, between who you were yesterday and who you're trying to be tomorrow. And now, as stars bloom above the city and a breeze tugs gently at the corners of your robe, you let it all settle in. You walked the courts, heard the arguments, sat by the ovens, learned the gossip. You know now that justice was not just inked in cuneiform, but lived in every grain sack loaned, every dowry counted, every sibling grumble over a goat. The city dims, and for the first time tonight, you feel it. Not just the weight of clay, but the warmth of it. The soft certainty that someone somewhere thought enough of your problem to write a law about it, even if that law involved a drunken neighbor and a pigeon. Now Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's final thoughts together. And now, you're still. The night has wrapped itself gently around the room. Maybe there's the soft hum of your fan, maybe just the sound of your own breathing slowing, like the slow breath of the river beneath Babylon's stone bridges. Your journey is complete. You've walked among sun-baked streets and slept in courtyards. You've listened to the complaints of the merchants, the whispers of temple lore, the silent promises of family drama echoing through plastered rooms. You've learned what made Babylon tick, not its gods or kings or monuments, but its people. Their deals, their arguments, their attempts, messy, earnest, sometimes ridiculous, to live together with some version of justice. Let it drift away now. The clamour of the court has faded. The scribes have packed up their tablets. Even the goats, chaotic beasts that they are, have finally settled. And you're safe, you're still. You're held gently in the quiet of a long-forgotten law that says everyone deserves peace by day's end. There's nothing left to remember, nothing you need to do, no laws to follow but the ones that slow your breath and soften your shoulders. Let yourself fall, not into clay or history or the weight of ancient codes, but into sleep, unwritten, unjudged. Just rest.